I welcome members and also viewers who may be watching our proceedings on Oireachtas TV to the 9th public session of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. Before I introduce our witnesses today, at the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. I'd like to extend a warm welcome on behalf of the committee to Mr Kevin McCarthy, Secretary General of Rural Community Development, and his officials Mr David Dalton, JP Mulhern and Eileen Davey. And before we commence formal proceedings, I must first begin with some formalities and advise our witnesses on the matter of privilege. I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of Section 1721 of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing rule of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And now I'd like to invite Mr McCarthy to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to address you here this afternoon. I welcome the opportunity to address the committee on the department's role and in particular on the contribution that we are making and can make to the overall national effort on climate action. The Department of Rural and Community Development was established by Government in July 2017. Its stated mission is to promote rural and community development and to support vibrant, inclusive and sustainable communities throughout Ireland. Climate change is an issue that will impact Ireland at a national, regional and community level. Whether it is farming, forestry, fisheries, tourism or recreation, rural communities are affected by the quality of the environment and are impacted on by its degradation. We have all witnessed over recent times how adverse weather conditions have a profound effect on those whose livelihoods depend on the elements. While the Department does not have a direct role in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from energy, agriculture or...
Take your phones off because that interferes with the recording or on airplane mode. Is everybody their phones off and on airplane mode? It's just for the benefit of people viewing that they won't be able to hear your contribution properly. Thank you.
While the Department does not have a direct role in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from energy, agriculture or transport, our core mission enables us to play an important role in supporting the transition to a low-carbon future. Supporting the development of resilient and sustainable communities is at the heart of the Department's mission. This is also at the heart of the challenge facing us in addressing climate change. Through a range of programmes, policies, supports and investments, the Department seeks to promote balanced regional development and economic opportunity, the diversification of rural economies, the enhancement of towns and villages as attractive places to live, the strengthening of communities, community life and opportunities for active local civic participation and decision-making. We are providing direct support for volunteering, social enterprise and social innovation. We are investing directly in locally generated ideas and initiatives in the green economy and in facilitating community ownership of projects, both literally and in terms of input into development strategies at local level. And we are helping people in accessing locally based job opportunities. All of these supports are at the core of delivering on the Department's mission to support vibrant, inclusive and sustainable communities, and all of these objectives are essential elements of a low-carbon future. I want to give some specific examples of the relevant policies, programmes, projects and supports that I am referring to. The LEADER programme will see almost 24 million invested in projects under the Rural Environment Team in the following sub-team areas: protection and sustainable use of water resources, protection and improvement of local biodiversity, development of renewable energy. Projects approved for funding include large-scale initiatives such as Glasgow Hydro Project in Waterford and smaller projects such as renewable energy heating systems and a self-sustainable solar-powered eco-lodge in County Clare. To date, more than €1.5 million has been approved to fund 58 projects under these sub-themes, and the Department looks forward to disbursing the full €24 million allocation in conjunction with local action groups. The Department is also providing a number of climate-relevant supports through the Dormant Accounts Fund, through the Social Enterprise and Social Innovation Fund measures, Social Inclusion and Community Activation Programme and the Community Services Programme. These include grants to applicants providing home insulation services, reducing our food waste, sustainable energy actions, beekeeping and training in thermal insulation installation. Additionally, investments under the Town and Village Renewal Scheme support the diversification of the rural economy through funding for enterprise hubs, digital hubs and other projects that support localised employment opportunities. These impact positively on commuting requirements and carbon emissions. The Department is also making investments through the Outdoor Recreation Infrastructure Scheme and the Walks Scheme that protect and sustain our natural heritage and identifies ways to assist communities in maximising the value of these assets for the local area. Greenways, blueways and mountain trails are delivering economic, recreational, health and climate benefits, reducing car journeys and creating employment and tourism opportunities. The Department's role in relation to local community structures, such as local community development committees and public participation networks, affords us the opportunity to harness all the potential resources at the disposal of communities by bringing together people, groups, agencies and voluntary and statutory bodies to make a positive difference in the development of sustainable communities. Through encouraging citizen engagement, we aim to increase awareness of climate issues and to foster community involvement in policy development and decision-making processes. In addition to these initiatives and programmes, the Department has an important coordination role when it comes to policies affecting rural Ireland across government. Realising our rural potential, the Action Plan for Rural Development, which was launched in 2017, contains over 270 specific actions to be taken across a variety of government departments. In addition to measures on enterprise, tourism, culture and connectivity, it is clear on the importance of our environment to ensuring sustainable rural development. It contains actions associated with climate mitigation, renewable energy and energy efficiency that are of relevance to rural Ireland. In general, these actions are to be delivered by the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment or its agencies. The Action Plan is also clear on the importance of climate adaptation measures, such as the Flood Relief Programme being delivered by the OPW. Reports in relation to progress on all actions in the Action Plan are published every 6 months and to date have shown that 93% of the actions across government were either completed on schedule or substantially advanced. It is important that we continue to look to further opportunities to support community-led initiatives in the green economy. The planned introduction by the Minister for Communications, Climate Action and the Environment of a renewable electricity support scheme will open up opportunities for rural communities to not only invest in new renewable electricity projects, but also potentially to develop and operate their own projects. Involving communities in the development of new renewable energy projects will not only provide a long-term sustainable economic dividend, but will also help to change the perception of renewable energy projects in rural Ireland. The Department has already provided funding support to those who are exploring the potential of renewable energy and to local projects in that sector. For example, a €50,000 grant has been committed over the next 2 years to facilitate a community-based renewable energy project in the Ivera Gaeltacht in Kerry. Across a range of activity, the Department is providing direct support to the required national climate action effort. The new Rural Regeneration and Development Fund, one of the 4 funds established under Project Ireland 2040, will provide further opportunity to build on this. Chair, I have attempted to give a very short overview of current investments, programmes and partnership activities of the Department of Rural and Community Development that are assisting communities to identify and engage in climate-positive initiatives. We recognise that the scale of the challenge involved in meeting climate action targets requires effort and mobilisation across government and at every level of society, with a particular challenge to engage citizens and communities. And we look forward to continued opportunities to support progress in this objective.
Thank you very much for your opening statement, Mr McCarthy. As members are aware, we have a strict speaking rota during the question and answer session, and we've allocated roughly about an hour for this session because, as you know, we have OPW coming in. So can you keep your contributions to questions rather than statements? And now I'd like to invite Deputy Breed Smith to start the session.
Thank you for your presentation. I suppose what I'd like to ask you first, before I go into the detail of each of the questions I want to ask, is if your report and your consideration is framed prior to the IPCC report or post, and I imagine it's prior, and what thoughts you would have on the impact of that report on your activities, your plans, your targets. Since it was published, I think it has shocked all of the official bodies across the world that are trying to deal with climate change, and I'm sure you must have given some thought to your own role in this. I'm assuming it's prior to the report being published, but I'd also like to know if you took into account a report produced by Met Éireann in 2016 that declared extreme weather events as the norm rather than the rare, and if that was taken into account when you're looking at what you can do in terms of dealing with rural Ireland and communities. My first question really is on the home insulation services, because in the context of last year's extreme weather events, the Dáil was forced to put it to the Taoiseach to give an extra 2 weeks fuel allowance to people suffering from those extreme cold conditions as a consequence of climate change. And you talk about grants that are provided for home insulation services. I'd just like to ask you if you think that scheme sufficiently covers people who are, I suppose, socio-economic profile means that they rely on the grants entirely rather than on their own means to retrofit their homes to be able to insulate and reduce their emissions.
I believe that is the remit of this particular department. Those grants are the SEAI. So if you could keep your questions directed to the responsibility of this department.
Okay, because the opening statement refers to grants to applicants providing home insulation services. So I'm only responding to the statement.
Well, it's okay, fine. Well, he says he can clarify. So
sure, it's up to him to say it doesn't apply or not, is it not, Chair?
Well, I'm just very conscious of the fact that you have just 10 minutes, so I just want to make sure.
I'm conscious of that too, so I hope this last few seconds will be taken into account. I'd like to also ask you, in relation to your dealing with involvement of communities in the development of renewable energy, if you have any thoughts on the idea of energy democracy, which is a widespread philosophy, idea about how we engage local communities. And I think anybody who was looking at the events around the motion on plastics yesterday in the Dáil would realise that communities want to be fully engaged in climate mitigation. The other question I'd like to ask you is your role in dealing with issues around the rural maintenance and rural sustainability. Recently, unfortunately, we passed in the Dáil a bill on a heritage bill that allowed for more burning and more slashing of the heritage and the landscape around the country, which will lead to a further impact on climate change, where ditches and hedgerows and all the rest of it are frequently cut back to the detriment of the sustainability of the environment, and secondly to the detriment of the sustainability of systems under the environment, for example bees. And I noticed you gave a small grant to some beekeeping enterprise. But these are obviously things that we need to join the dots on. If we're concerned about sustainability of the environment, then what role would your department have in leaning on either the parties or the government to say that this heritage bill is not a good idea because it actually impacts on the role your department has on maintaining sustainability in rural affairs? And my last question is about maintaining rural transport. And so the winding down of public services in terms of rural transport and post offices, do you believe that has an impact on not helping to mitigate climate change because it forces people to travel further to reach a post office? It forces them to use private transport because public transport has been removed.
Thanks, Chair. Just to clarify quickly on your first question as to whether what I've set out predates the IPCC report. It does. What I've been describing, I suppose, is a programme of activity that the Department is engaged in across a range of programmes and funding schemes. Collectively, I suppose the purpose of those is to support rural development and to support the development of sustainable communities in terms of the broad description of what that involves. As I said in my opening statement, through those investments, we do have the opportunity in working with communities, in facilitating communities in coming forward with ideas to support initiatives and projects that have a very direct climate action impact and a very direct positive climate effect, but it's not necessarily the core purpose of those programmes. At a broader level, I suppose as well, given our remit in respect of promoting rural development and supporting balanced regional development, again I would say that there's a very strong consistency in terms of the overall effort that we're engaged in with the climate action agenda, because obviously if you're supporting the development of strong sustainable communities at a local level, on a regionally dispersed level, if you're giving those communities the tools that they need in terms of employment opportunity, in terms of quality environments in which to live, you're supporting a better balanced development overall, and I think that's very consistent with the climate action agenda. So specifically, we wouldn't have taken the IPCC report into account in the design of these programmes, but obviously as we run out all of the programmes and funds that we're involved in, we would keep a watch to the overall policy landscape on all of its fronts and ensure that what we are investing in and what we are supporting is delivering on government policy across the broad range of objectives that government has for rural Ireland, and obviously climate change is an important part of that, as I've hopefully described. As the Chair has clarified in relation to the fuel allowance and your question around home insulation services, while I've cited a couple of projects that have supported retrofitting of homes, we got involved in those projects because as part of wider funding schemes, communities were coming forward with initiatives in that area that allowed us to support particular projects. But we don't have overall responsibility for retrofitting homes, which, as the Chair has pointed out, would fall under the remit of SEAI and the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment. In relation to energy democracy and engaging communities, I mean, I think that's very much at the core of what we are trying to do generally in terms of community empowerment. And, you know, again, I described very briefly in the opening statement some of the structures and the framework that we have in place to try to generate capacity at community level to allow communities to engage more effectively with decision-making processes, both at local authority level and with central government. So I suppose our role is to try to generate that capacity and develop the structures locally that allow communities to engage with what central government is trying to do and allows communities to input into decision making at central government level and at local authority level. So, you know, energy communities would be part of that, and again there are some initiatives where we are supporting particular energy communities. Again, SEAI, as you will have heard, I think yourselves, has a very good scheme around energy communities, and we're certainly looking to see what support we can give to that in terms of how our various programmes and investments can align better with what they're trying to do there, and we can support communities in I suppose, generating the ideas themselves that allow them to make a real contribution to what they see as their requirements at a local level. Again, on your questions in relation to protecting biodiversity and the Heritage Bill and indeed rural transport, again, you're asking me to comment on, I suppose, policy responsibilities of other government departments. So just to make that point, and obviously, you know, protection of biodiversity is first and foremost the responsibility of the Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. But clearly, again, what we are doing in relation to the outdoor recreation scheme, for example, in investing in greenways and blueways and walks, trails and so on, is really around helping communities to identify their own natural heritage locally as a real asset for the community. And in general terms, that is what we are trying to do in terms of supporting rural communities, empowering rural communities. It's encouraging them and supporting them to make the best use of their natural amenities.
Can I rephrase the question then, because I probably didn't make myself understood. Is there any possibility that through your remit as Rural Affairs and Heritage as their remit, can actually talk to each other and join the dots and make sure that whatever happens is in the interests of Rural Affairs and Heritage? Because it seems to me that there's a salami type approach to dealing with the environment and the impact on the environment, which will serve nobody any good when it comes to dealing with climate change. You have a tiny budget to do a huge amount of work that doesn't reflect the crisis that we're facing.
Thank you for Deputy Smith. Can I bring in Deputy Butler? You have 10 minutes, Deputy.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach.
Questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm going to focus on flooding, if you don't mind, because I think it's an issue that we all have to deal with in our constituencies.
In relation to the work that this department is
Yes.
doing? Yeah.
Yes.
Because you know OPW are coming in another hour. They're coming in after. OPW are coming in afterwards.
Okay, oh,
Yeah,
well,
this is
maybe.
the department. So is there anybody from Fianna Fáil, because I know Senator Daly is down as
Senator
the
Daly is
questioner.
actually in the Shannon at the moment. He
Yeah.
sent his
Did you want to
apologies.
come in, Deputy Chambers?
I think if Deputy Butler wants to, you can ask other. Do you want to ask other questions?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, we'll move to Deputy Heydon then, while we were waiting. Deputy Heydon, do you want to come in there now?
Or Murphy?
Thank you.
If I can, with the agreement of the other members, if everyone's happy with that, I will. And thank Mr. McCarthy.
10 minutes.
Thank Mr. McCarthy and his officials for coming in. I'm struck from your presentation that the potential that we have here, obviously a lot of what we were talking about in committee is realising that our approach to climate action needs to be a whole of government approach and across departments. And I think what we need to get to is a point where obviously you have a very specific remit in relation to the role of community development and assisting those great community groups. But how much awareness or how much interaction is there between yourselves and the other state departments that provide other supports, in that you make sure there's not duplication and that you make sure that you're filling any gaps in that regard? And also then, do you find, you kind of touched on it, so I'm gathering from what you're saying in your presentation that there are areas where we can leverage co-funding from two different departments. So I know, as an example, in one local area in Kildare, to me, we have the Drogheda grant, which is for the Drogheda landfill in the Greater Carbery area, and sports clubs in those areas can apply for a community grant under that local scheme, but they can co-fund it with, let's say, Sports Capital, and that means that two small grants go together and they can get something very sizable done. And I'm sure as we see more community energy groups be developed, if you could co-fund with other departments, is that a possibility for you, or is your mind open to that? And is there a real awareness in the department as to what all the other supports that are available in other departments that you can cross over with? I think the local authority has a key role to play here, because they will have a lot of that local knowledge as to where groups are at. You know, the Town and Village Renewal scheme is such a really positive scheme, and I think now, particularly the fact that communities have got more aware of it, what I'm seeing is an even higher standard of applications coming in, because what those community groups are now doing are probably planning a year in advance, rather than just trying to cobble together an application just before a deadline to get it in. And they're giving it more thought, and then you get a much better quality application with a stronger, more robust long-term plan, and a probably better bang for our buck in terms of taxpayers' money then going supporting those groups. As we see tidy towns groups and other energy groups develop, or tidy town groups go into the more sustainable energy field, then I think the space is really there for us to support those community groups, and your department is absolutely key to that. This is not something just for the Department of Climate Action on that. And as I say, I know, in Kilcullen, in South Kildare, we have a sustainable energy community established, and a very progressive group, community driven, and we're very lucky to have some experts who have some expertise from their professions and their jobs, volunteering their time to come in. And have you plans that could assist existing community groups like that to look at energy efficient measures, or that how can we help to support them? And then that's for groups that have a fair bit of knowledge, and I would think of Newbridge Tidy Towns, which is obviously the biggest town in my constituency of over 20,000 people. They have the whole second year now of winning a green flag for a sustainability model along the linear park. Again, they're not starting from scratch. They have a fair knowledge of this. But for the groups maybe who aren't as advanced as those, how do you find, is there support they need to even get their head around what the type of projects are? And what role is your department playing in opening people's minds to that, who are at the very early stages in terms of that? And do you find there's a geographical spread? Is there gaps in the country where maybe there's less of this activity happening? Because obviously once one energy community is developed within a county, you'll find others will probably prop up nearby because they'll see it's a good idea and they'll see the merit there. But ultimately funding will drive an awful lot of this. If a local active voluntary community group can see they can access funding by doing certain measures, it will encourage them and entice them into that area. And no more so is that obvious than in the areas of greenways and blueways, where there's obviously a very positive spin-off in terms of tourism and economic activity to bring people into areas. But I think in every measure like that, we have got to be linking in environmental sustainability and positive environmental story into that. And that's why, on the face of it, when you were coming in here, you were probably thinking this isn't necessarily, you're not the lead department in this by any means, but your role is absolutely key, because I think everything we cover in committee over recent weeks and in coming weeks, it talks about us getting people around the country to buy into the idea that we need to be doing more. And we have so many good active community groups that just need that bit of support. And as I say, there's some who are at an advanced stage and just need grants and schemes to assist them in what their ideas are. There's others who need help in formulating those ideas. So on those points, and in particular in relation to the Rural Fund and that you have, how best we can harness that with the use of other departments, I'd be interested to hear your views on that.
Thank you very much, Deputy Heydon. Mr. McCarthy.
Okay, there's quite a lot of ground to cover there. I suppose just on the question of interaction with other departments and the need to avoid duplication and to identify gaps and so on, we do have a lot of interaction with other departments. I mean, specifically on the climate action front, we're represented on the relevant cabinet committee and on the senior officials group that feeds into that. But more generally as a department, I think in terms of where we're positioned as a department, our interface with other departments is actually core to what we do, because our remit is really around trying to support and promote the development of rural communities and communities generally, and we can only do that by interacting with government departments across a wide range of remits, be it transport, tourism, heritage, so on. So we have a lot of interaction with those, and we try to share as much information as we can. We try to get to the best understanding that we can around the agendas of other departments, around where they are at in terms of various programmes, projects, initiatives, policies and so on, and try to align with them and add value where we can. But I would recognise that that's always an area that we can do better, and we have to continue to seek to do better. And specifically on the climate front, I mean, a lot of what we are supporting, I wouldn't pretend that it was anything other than really touching at the margins in a lot of these areas. And somebody referred to the fact that we do have a small budget. We are a small player in the scheme of things in terms of the scale of our investments and what our investments in their own right can achieve. But I think where we can influence and impact is through our interaction with other departments, and in particular I think by being able to offer a capacity to other departments to be able to engage with communities at a local level. And I think that's where our role in supporting community organisations and supporting the structures that allow community organisations to engage effectively with government and that allow us to help them to build the capacity to interact effectively with government. That's really where our role comes in, and we do see that as a really important part of our responsibility. And I think you touch on an important point in your question around those areas that are perhaps less well developed in terms of community engagement and civic engagement, and that is a real challenge for us, because there's an element here of the degree of social capital that's in a community. The better they're able to access information around what's available, the better equipped they are to be able to exploit the benefits of various government investments, and we have a duty to support those communities that are less well developed on that front. And I think the whole structure around local community development committees, public participation networks, it's very much a developing structure. And, you know, part of that and part of our responsibility in that is to support the local authorities in building that structure. We are putting resources in to support them directly in doing that, but there's a whole capacity building piece around, you know, training, sharing of best practice, networking, supporting networks of communities so that they can learn from one another. And there are some specific things that my colleague might want to come in on the leader front around, for example, sharing best practice between leader groups around the country so that people can see the potential of what's there, and they can see what other communities have done. They can talk to them and hear from them around how they have done that and learn from that. And it's really, it's about creating the, I suppose, the facility for all of that to happen is where we would see our potential contribution. You talked specifically about the energy communities, and SEAI are doing brilliant work on this front in terms of supporting those energy communities that are in place, and I know they have a really good programme of development with those communities. In fact, we're meeting with SEAI next week just to talk about that programme and how, again, we can weigh in behind them in offering support, again, through our interaction with local authorities and local community organisations on various fronts. On the town and village, I think your comments on that are very welcome. That's a programme that has really had a huge impact, and you know, since 2016, you know, there's been very significant investment. 675 projects across the country have been supported, and what we have now through a sequence of calls is we have a kind of, there's an established lead-in now for local authorities and for communities to identify for themselves the potential of that programme. And what we're seeing is you know, an increasingly high quality of proposals coming through from local communities ultimately, that are feeding into approvals under that scheme. And equally with the Rural Regeneration and Development Fund, which, you know, does involve investment of very significant scale. You know, I talked about our budget being minor enough in the overall scheme of things, but that new fund that was created by government under the National Development Plan, it's a $1 billion fund over the next 10 years, and that gives us the opportunity to really impact on rural regeneration in all of its forms and to help communities to deliver on the various national strategic outcomes that are set out in the national planning framework, including on the climate action front. And I suppose one of the challenges there is to ensure that that fund does, I suppose, leverage possibility in terms of being able to build on investments and commitments of other government departments. And again, we have a good mechanism for interacting with other departments around their investment plans to ensure that that fund is really adding value and is really helping communities to make the best of the possibilities from government.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McCarthy. Deputy Pringle, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'm trying to get my head around just what's been saying there. So basically, as I understand from what you're saying here today, is that basically your department isn't about actually doing anything. Your department is a liaison between communities and the rest of government, and can point out to communities where they can do stuff and tie in the government with that, and that's the role that your department plays. Would that be right?
Well, not entirely right. That's an important part of our role, but we also have very significant programmes of investment in our own right, whether it's through the town and village scheme or the leader programme, you know, all of the various programmes and investments. SICAP, community services programme. So we are investing directly in communities ourselves. But a really important part of our role is to also, I suppose, provide a facility for communities to strengthen their capacity to engage with all of the possibilities in terms of government interaction and local authority interaction.
So when a community applies to Leader and gets funding from Leader, it's from Leader they get the funding, and that's whatever it is, whatever that funding for. How do you roll that out around the rest of the country then, or do you have any role in relation to that, or is, no?
You mean, say, in terms of replicating projects, more widely?
If a community does something that works,
yeah.
how does that get out around the rest of the country through the department, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the challenge for us, to share best practice and to replicate best practice. And we do organise workshops, for example, for leader companies. My colleague who has responsibility for the leader programme might want to say a little bit more about that. But I suppose a lot of what we do is investing in ideas. Communities are encouraged to come forward with their own ideas, whether it's under Leader or whether it's under the Town and Village programme, or any of the other investment opportunities that are there. I think a challenge for us is to better capture the impact of what's working and what's working well, and then to share that more widely, so that other communities can, as I say, learn from that experience, draw on it, and see the possibility for themselves. But there are some, specific efforts at trying to facilitate that sharing of good practice and that sharing of experience.
Well, that's
do you want to comment?
What I want to get at.
Yeah.
I will just when I'm just finished. What I want to get at is that, like, I mean, how if someone works well in Waterford, how does that get through to Donegal?
Yeah, just to explain, the Leader programme is I suppose, a significant part of what the department does. It has an investment of €250 million over the duration of the programme. It's divided amongst 3 themes, and one of those themes is directly rural environment, so things like rural energy, water conservation. And our job is to support the local groups that are delivering that programme. It is a bottom-up approach, community-led local development. But as part of that, you're right, we need to identify the good projects and try and ensure that best practice is shared around the rest of the country. Part of our role in all that is, as Kevin mentioned, is in hosting workshops where the different groups can come together and share their ideas. We had a workshop on the rural environment earlier this year, where a range of different ideas were shared and different best practice examples were demonstrated. Just to give you one example, the local group down in Wexford has developed an advisory guide. Now, it's a very simple, handy, easy to use guide for community groups and small businesses that are delivering investments under Leader, but it covers things like insulation, power generation, lighting, all things in a very simple manner that they can then use in designing their applications and designing their projects under Leader. So that ensures that the sort of investment that's happening under Leader is proofed for climate change and environment type measures. But beyond all of that, there's a network that shares different best practice ideas. So even if you go on to our social media platforms or onto the website, you can see there's very specific interactive map dealing with environment type projects. And you can look at different parts of the country and you can see where case studies have been identified of good practice of environmental climate change type projects that are delivering on the ground. And that's a good avenue for both the local action groups that are delivering the programme, but also for the community groups themselves to see how projects can be delivered in other areas and how that might be applicable to their own areas. So there's quite an amount of work in trying to share all that knowledge and experience.
But where does your role as a department come in and making that happen, like, other than just putting out the information and hoping that people will pick up on it? And is that what your role is?
Well, our role is to try and bring all of these groups together to ensure that information does flow between them and to identify areas where funding should be best delivered. Like in designing the Leader programme, there was a significant effort put into identifying what are the key areas where funding should be delivered. There was workshops hosted with all of the groups as well to identify the types of areas where they might want to concentrate their spend. At the end of the day, it is community-led local development, so it has to be a bottom-up approach. But what we try to do is put the structures in place to ensure that the groups that are delivering programmes and the groups that are applying for projects under the programmes have access to the best information about what they can deliver under the programme.
Okay, just like to ask as well, what work the department are doing to develop new sustainable business models for Indigenous and new industries, for example, like within towns and villages and stuff like that there, what actually you're doing in relation to that? Is that, again, Leader, or?
You mean generally, business generally?
Well, to make towns and rural towns and villages sustainable, and that will grow.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, like, the purpose of the Town and Village Renewal programme to take that is very much to invest in the regeneration of towns and villages so that they are more attractive places to live. And that involves investing in micro-enterprise and enterprise opportunities. It might involve public realm developments and so on. There are a range of potential projects that can be supported under a programme like that, but including very much investing in supports for business. Now, obviously, when it comes to supports for business, there's the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation has the responsibility for supporting business, and through the LEOs, Enterprise Ireland is providing direct support to enterprise and has a very strong regional development remit as part of that, and that's a really important objective from their point of view, to ensure that there's a rebalancing of job opportunity. But from our perspective, we again try to support the effort that that department is making in terms of investment in enterprise opportunity where we can.
So again, if something works in North Donegal, how do you roll that out across the whole country, or do you by just putting it out there and people hopefully will pick up on it, not there?
Yeah, well, again, I mean, I suppose my colleague has described the very particular initiatives that happen under the LEADER programme to try and showcase best practice. I mean, I think on all of these programmes that we're investing in, we're thinking very deliberately about how we can better showcase the impact of what we're doing across all of these investments, and to showcase, from a case study point of view, the opportunity that's there and the potential that's there for others. It is an important objective of ours, and it's something that I think we have to put a lot more effort into. We are doing it under particular programmes, be it LEADER or be it, networks of public participation networks, LCDCs, in terms of sharing best practice around developing local economic and community plans. So there are a number of networks that we support that allow people to share best practice in terms of what they're doing, and we're trying to do more to support those and to showcase at a general level what's happening in rural Ireland, so that communities can see the potential and the possibility for themselves.
But the onus is always on the communities to see and develop it and put forward, rather than on you saying this works, go for that.
Well, we try to do both, like we don't try to prescribe to communities what is what they should be doing, but we certainly try to point them to examples of what they could be doing. I suppose it is about trying to share information and make information available to the best extent possible, so that people do have the opportunity to see for themselves ideas and access ideas that may work for them.
Thank you very much. Can I open it to the floor now? Anybody?
Question, Cathaoirleach, thank you very much. You spoke there earlier in relation to the National Planning Framework and you know how important it is. And I just want to ask a supplementary question to Deputy Heydon. The Rural Regeneration and Development Fund of £1 billion obviously is hugely important for all our towns and villages. Will climate action be a priority in terms of the rollout of this? That's the question.
I suppose the purpose of the Rural Regeneration Fund is to allow towns and villages of less than 10,000 population to identify what they themselves see as the investment opportunities that can allow them to, I suppose, progress and develop. It's to support regeneration across towns and villages of that scale. There are 10 national strategic outcomes, as you know, in the National Planning Framework, including the achieved transition to a low carbon economy. And the only requirement of proposals coming in under that fund is that they deliver on the national strategic outcomes of the National Planning Framework. So project proposers need to be able to identify how what they're proposing is delivering on any of those national strategic outcomes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I suppose just the first point I'd like to put out is that when we talk about community, we need to think of rural and urban. Sometimes I think we lose in your department. It sometimes weighs heavily on rural, but when it comes to climate change, it's going to be everyone, every community every area of the country. You say in your statement that while the department does not have a direct role in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from energy, agriculture or transport, our key mission enables us to play an important role in supporting the transition to a low-carbon future. So that's really good. So you identify you have a key role in climate mitigation and adaptation. But I'd like to ask, what are the 3 actions you're taking, given that it is an important role and part of your mission, core mission?
Yeah, well, I suppose just the first point to make around the rural and urban divide, the department has a responsibility for rural development and for community development, but community in that context is both rural and urban. So just to be very clear on that, so we do support urban communities and the structures that we have in place around community empowerment, citizen engagement. All of those things relates equally to rural and urban contexts. So
that would be like communities, say within Dublin, Tala, Skerries, Rush. They're all communities within the
absolutely.
urban framework.
So the framework that's in place for community development applies nationally in both urban and rural settings. And so, for example, under our what was the Rapid scheme, for example, we would be investing in urban areas and in urban communities with particular disadvantage and so on. The North East Inner City project, for example, we're investing in that in Dublin. So just while, yes, there tends to be a very strong focus on the rural dimension, and that's a really important part of our mission when it comes to community development. It does apply to both, just to be very clear on that. I suppose, like in terms of what we're doing, like what I've tried to describe in terms of the department's role is we do support balanced regional development. We see that as a really important part of our remit. So investing in communities, in the regeneration of communities, in opportunity for communities through the various schemes and programmes. That's really about ensuring that people in rural Ireland in particular have the opportunity to live and work locally. So if it's investments in enterprise hubs or digital hubs, for example, in supporting digital connectivity, all of those things are part and parcel of our policies and programmes, and that is empowering communities and making them attractive places for people to live and work. And it is live and work is an important dimension of that, because obviously, there's a carbon implication if people have to commute long distances for work opportunities. So supporting micro enterprise or supporting communities as attractive places to live and work is core to that, and that's where I describe our mission to support the generation and development of rural communities as being very much front and centre of the climate action agenda. I think secondly, I would point to what the work that we're doing in terms of community development and active citizenship and supporting active citizenship, whether it's through the public participation networks which are geared at trying to engage citizens with decision-making processes locally. I would see that as a very direct contribution to the climate action agenda, because ultimately government needs to be able to engage directly with citizens and to involve citizens in decision-making processes locally. We need local authorities to be identifying their own development needs, to be coming up with their own strategies for addressing those development needs, to be involving all of the actors at a local level in identifying what those are, to be engaging directly with communities and community organisations and feeding into that. So by I suppose creating and sustaining the framework that allows that to happen, again, I think we're impacting very directly on the climate action agenda.
That's great. And so do you have a framework that we can see the committee with a list of criteria that you are doing specifically that are corralling all of the community groups in Ireland towards climate mitigation adaptation? Have you something to lead communities? Because without a lead in terms of climate change and without leadership and direction, we're at nothing. So I'd love if you had criteria that
what we can do, I mean, if it's helpful, we can describe that framework structure that I've tried to describe there in terms of, LCDCs and public participation networks and so on, and maybe give some flavour of some of the activities that have been engaged in at a local level in terms of awareness raising. I mean, what I would say is there's a potential there that isn't yet fully realised in terms of the opportunity to work through these structures to engage on the climate action agenda. I know the PPNs, for example, have been involved in consultations and leading consultation processes on behalf of the Climate Advisory Council, for example. But there is, I mean, I think they stand ready to do more. There is a particular issue around the PPNs in terms of the level of representation from the environmental pillar on PPNs. The structure of the PPNs as established was that they were to be representative of community, social inclusion, community and voluntary and environmental pillars. The environmental representation is very low. And we've tried to work with the environmental pillar to see how we can activate a greater involvement from environmental organisations on those PPNs. I think it's important that we can make progress on that front, and I think, if I might add, any mandate that this committee would give to that structure in terms of helping to deliver on the climate action agenda more generally would be helpful from our point of view, because I think there is a willingness to engage and lead at a local level on this.
Mr McCarthy, if you could send that directly to the clerk of the committee, we can circulate it out to everybody then.
Sorry, can I just one more?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Your time
with
is
regard to
screeching to the whole.
Yeah, I understand. The RES scheme, when is that going to be rolled out? And if communities avail of support for solar or wind microgeneration, is there an opportunity for your department to be involved in the selling onwards of the supply to the grid?
Just say, the RES scheme has been developed by our colleagues in Communications, Climate Action and the Environment, but we have met with them in relation to it, and we will be staying in close contact with them in relation to it. I can't give you a timeline on its development. Quite honestly, I just don't know is why I can't. But we are keen to be involved in discussions on that as it develops, because we do see opportunities for communities in the development of that scheme, and I think we can be helpful in terms of assisting our colleague department in interacting with communities, again through the structures that I'm describing.
Okay, Deputy Chambers.
Thanks, Chair. Just briefly, just like as follows up on what Senator Sullivan said, is there any a specific criteria? I know you've mentioned some of the things you're supporting that would have an impact, say, on climate change. Do you have anything specific in the application phase that would be climate change specific? Because I know, like, it's kind of a coincidental impact, is what you're describing, rather than a direct one. Is there anything you're planning to achieve a direct impact and something that would kind of a positive action rather than it being a coincidence of people, say, not commuting or whatever? That's just one example. And then just can you outline just the PPNs and the LCDCs? Where does that fit in with the relationship with the Customs House? Can you describe? I know you're obviously you're kind of a hybrid department linked with other ones. And on that, do you think you could perhaps be given greater responsibilities so that instead of having to engage or interact at every level as a department, would it be worthwhile if you were empowered in a greater way to do what your departmental title is around community development? So perhaps say that you don't have to be referring to other departments going forward. Do you think that would help your remit in this area and other areas?
Okay. I suppose just to the second question first, I mean, when it comes to supporting community development and empowering community development, we don't work through the Customs House in relation to that. I mean, we have a direct relationship with local authorities. That is our mandate, and that is clearly,
So the PPNs are all done directly,
they
right?
are.
There's no link?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. So, I mean, again, there can be a kind of an assumption sometimes that every interaction with the local authorities is transacted through the Customs House. It's not.
That's good.
The local authorities would have a lot of direct engagement or a direct relationship with various government departments in relation to different aspects of their function, and in relation to this particular function, their direct relationship is with us. So there isn't any issue there from that point of view. I mean, in terms of our mandate more generally and our mandate to work through government, I mean, I think we do have an important coordinating role in relation to rural development, and the nature of rural development is that it's contingent on a lot of actors and interactions, you know, across business and enterprise, across, you know, tourism and transport, across heritage, Gaeltacht and so on. So our role is actually to try to bring a coherence to all of that, to bring a coherence to that engagement, and we do that to the best we can, but it does involve necessarily interacting across all of those, and I think, you know, the mechanisms and the structures are there for us to do that effectively. Specifically in relation to the kind of the accidental impact, I think it's not accidental, just to say, because I suppose through all of our programmes of investment, we seek to deliver on government objectives across a range of fronts, and climate action is one of those, and it's clearly, you know, a hugely important front. You know, I referred earlier in the question from Deputy Butler to the objectives of the Rural Regeneration and Development Fund, which is to deliver on the national strategic outcomes across those 10 defined outcomes. So in that sense, there's a very direct link in terms of the criteria of that fund to the climate action agenda. Similarly, in relation to LEADER, for example, we would require projects in our proposers in putting forward applications to identify the impact, any climate impact of what they are doing. Now, we continually keep the criteria and the eligibility requirements of all of our schemes under review as we go from call to call. So that's something that we can keep a very direct watch on, but there is more than an accidental outcome here.
Yeah, thank you. Deputy Sherlock.
Thank you very much, and forgive me for being late. Wednesdays are days where you have to be present at other committees as well, so I do apologise for being late. I just want to go straight into it. First of all, I welcome the submission here, which I've read, and I just want to ask some key questions, again on the theme of building capacity, if you will, in relation to the LCDCs and the PPNs. The communities are coming together and they're generating ideas about what it is that they want to do, and there's an articulation of those ideas or those projects through the local authorities. And I just want to get a sense from the department, or a better understanding from the department, of how the department is actually facilitating or helping to build capacity so that we can see a greater throughput of these projects. So very localised projects, you know, with a climate change theme, if you will. You know, I speak to one specific project that I'm very familiar with, which is the IRD Duhallow project in relation to warmer homes. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that project, but it's an extremely good project whereby people who are dependent on Department of Social Protection payment, can, be facilitated with a grant, if you will, and they will actually come out and refit or retrofit houses, for attic insulation. And that's one bespoke and very valuable project for the community that, that I represent. And I'm just wondering how you can translate that across a wider geographical spectrum in the first instance, and secondly then, just to ask how you build capacity then on that kind of project and other type of projects, because the LCDCs and the PPNs, they have a great potential to build capacity and deliver projects for everybody, develop real impact, if you will, and I just want to get a sense of an understanding from the department of that dynamic. That's the first question.
Yeah, Deputy Pringle asked that earlier, so I'm going to ask it to be responded to briefly. Yeah, well, but you can go ahead. Do you want to ask a further question?
Will I ask the second question? Yeah. Well, just the community-owned energy projects. I just want to get an understanding of whether or not the department has clear targets for community-owned energy projects, and how, again, to use the word facilitating, how does it plan to facilitate more of those types of projects? Because I think they have the potential to be real game changers locally. And if arising from our deliberations here in committee, when we compose or compile a report, if we can speak to that potential in a real way, I think that would be very helpful. So that's the second question. And also in relation to, I suppose, planning policy, just to follow up from Grace's point, I just want to get an understanding then of whether or not there is a clear understanding of whether there is a need to ensure that houses in rural areas are built near settlements, if you will, so as to reduce the dependency on cars. Now, you may say that's the Department of the Environment, competence, but again, just to have rural and community development's perspective on that as well. Thank you.
Some of this you've addressed already. So
yeah. Well, I'll take the last one actually first around the planning requirements, and I suppose the national planning framework does set out, the collective government objective in respect of that, which will inform planning requirements, which, as you rightly point out, is a matter for the Department of Housing. But just specifically in relation to the attractiveness of residential occupancy in towns and villages, it might be just worth mentioning that our Minister last week announced a pilot scheme in relation to town and village residential occupancy in 6 pilot areas, and the intention of that is to try to it's to support those 6 communities in the first instance, to try to identify solutions and actions that will make their town or village a more attractive place to live in, because we know what the patterns of settlement have been in rural areas. Towns and villages are emptying out as people are living in the wider hinterland, and we want to try to find a way of turning the tide in respect of the attractiveness of living in those settlements. So we're hoping that the pilot in those 6 areas will identify potentially a range of possible innovations or solutions, locally generated in the first instance, but potentially requiring action at central level to support them. But we're keen that something will emerge from that can be useful in terms of our policy effort to try and support town and village residential occupancy. Just in relation to the targets around community-owned energy projects, again, the SEAI, as we referred to earlier, have their energy communities scheme, and you're probably familiar with this, Deputy, so forgive me if I'm going over familiar ground here. I think they're at over 200 at the moment, and they have a target to grow that to 500. Now we're actually looking to get into a discussion with them to see how we can support them in achieving that target, because I think we can be helpful to them. And similarly in relation to the REIS, which offers the opportunity of community ownership of renewable energy projects. Again, we're keen, as I referred to earlier, to engage with the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment around what their plans are there, so that we can support them in meeting realistic targets around that. On the question that Deputy Pringle had earlier asked, and you've sort of asked in a slightly different way, I will ask my colleague to come in, because I attempted an earlier answer and he might give a better answer around the capacity building at community level. But just maybe to mention one thing that I didn't mention, under the LEADER programme we have project officers in each county which do some of what you're describing around sort of activating involvement in communities and talking to them about what they've seen working elsewhere, and that's a good vehicle actually for sharing good practice and sharing experience.
I suppose, just with particular reference to the LCDCs and building their capacity, one of the biggest challenges for us is actually building their strategic capacity. They're still very much in the early stages of their evolution. They're only in place since 2014, but they've developed quite strongly in the last few years, particularly in terms of their operational capacity. But strategic capacity is still a bit of a challenge, and I suppose there's a number of things that the department is doing to support that capacity. We have a number of networks in place at a regional level, and they mirror the regional assembly districts as well. And we would support those networks, and we would attend those networks, and we would use those as well to share best practice. Deputy Pringle would have mentioned that earlier on, and that would be another avenue through which we would support the dissemination of good practice and good ideas, whether it would be just in general in terms of their operation at a local level, but also in terms of specific programmes. We're also developing a capacity development programme for LCDCs at the moment in partnership with local authorities, and we're hoping to roll that out in its full iteration from next year. We also have the department supporting a programme of specific supports around its programmes, such as SICAP and LEADER, and JP might be able to speak to that one more specifically. But we're also providing guidance as well to LCDCs around their general activities and around the local economic and community planning function which they have, which is one of their primary functions, if not the primary function. And that is a mechanism through which they are charged with coordinating planning and bringing a more joined-up approach to local and community development, and bringing communities on board to develop those coordinated and integrated actions at a local level.
But can I just, very briefly, sorry, like is climate action and mitigation mapped across that then?
At the moment, no, it's not. Okay. But what we're looking at with local authorities is to rework their local economic and community plans with them. They're 6-year plans. And most of them would only be in place from around 2015, 2016, so wouldn't be due to lapse until, say, 2022, 2023. But what we're doing at the moment, for a number of reasons, is working with local authorities to actually redo those plans based on the learning that we've had over the last few years, given that they're nascent structures, and to take on board other priorities, which include climate action, but also Brexit, for example, which wouldn't have been on our radar at the time. So we're working specifically with them, and we're working with the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment as well to help raise awareness and understanding at a local level, and we will be building that into our local economic and community planning guidance, for example. But at a higher level, where we've got the framework policy for local and community development, and that also includes actions to help build the capacity of communities to engage, be included and participate in policy and decision-making processes, but also the structures at a local level, whether it's community groups or whether it's LCDCs or local authorities, or even government departments in terms of how they engage with those structures, and the development of toolkits and best practice models for inclusion and guidelines.
Neville?
Yeah, if this question has been answered already, Chair, I've no problem with it, and I'll just read the transcript. Just to ask the department what kind of interaction they're having with the Department of Agriculture in relation to carbon footprints in the future re-2020 and 2030. I was at a Chagas brief this morning in relation to nitrous oxides, methane, particularly around methane and the different soil types. And, you know, some soil types, if they're wetter, the carbon footprint can actually be decreased, and if some soil types are drier, the carbon footprint could be decreased, but that there's no actual hard data around that. So I just want to know, has there been any interaction between your department and the Department of Agriculture on planning for that?
Okay, thank you. Mr. McCarthy?
Yeah, but I suppose I referred earlier to the arrangements across government through the Cabinet Committee, ultimately in respect of the climate action agenda, and you know, we're represented on the Cabinet Committee and on the senior officials group that feeds into that, so that does provide for our interaction with agriculture and with the other lead sectoral departments in respect of the agenda.
So, but there's no specific.
Well, the climate, the Cabinet Subcommittee on Climate Action is what you're saying.
Not on that. Okay. But for example, DK, the Department of Climate Action, Communications, Climate Action and the Environment would have a lot of direct engagement with agriculture in respect of national mitigation plan and so on.
Right. Thank you.
Deputy Murphy.
Beatrice Coherlock, and thanks to Mr. McCarthy and his colleagues for being with us today. And again, quite a number of the questions I want to ask have been answered. So I'm going to keep it brief, and forgive me if I'll be as brief as everybody else, even briefer. This basically to me is about balanced regional development and our environment, and that's why I welcome the interaction here today. And you know, in relation to balanced regional development, it might be all about getting big factories into areas, but it might be about a lot of these smaller projects, green projects where communities become involved in. Now, just sort of referring back to Deputy Sherlock and Deputy Pringle's questions, where you have community groups, and there's a plethora of them out there at the moment, who have really good plans for walkways, whether they're through bogs, hilly grounds or whatever, has all of those projects to go through the local authority? Or are those community groups, which are PPNs, fully operational, can they directly come to you? Can they develop their project through you? Or must it all go through the local authority system? Because I feel that some groups, I'm talking specifically about my part of the country, might fall through the system, and a lot of good proposed work that is in the pipeline could be lost. Secondly, I myself am my party spokesperson on OPW and flood relief. I noticed in your address, and I wasn't here for it all, you state that the action plan is also clear on the importance of climate adoption measures such as the flood relief programme to be delivered by the OPW, and I know we'll be speaking to the OPW in a few moments. Are you satisfied that that is moving quickly enough and in a sufficient manner? Because, as you rightly say, that is a huge issue now in many parts of the country, and I've seen the devastation myself. So just those two brief questions, so I could get some clarity on them.
Yeah, just I suppose in respect of the opportunities for community organisations to access funding outside of the local authority structure. In Leader, for example, local action groups can engage with the Leader company, generally the LCDC, but it's slightly parallel to the local authority structure. So there are opportunities, and a lot of the funding and a lot of the funding programmes that we run out will provide direct access opportunity for community organisations. The RRDF itself, it doesn't require a local authority lead sponsorship, but it does require that the lead applicant would be a public body, and there are lots of governance and accountability reasons for that, but there are the opportunities there for community organisations and indeed for local development companies to become involved. On the flood relief programme, I suppose the reference in my opening statement is really to the actions set out in the action plan for rural development, and we're satisfied that the OPW are delivering on the specific actions set out in the action plan for rural development on that front, but I'm sure you'll get the opportunity to test them further on that this afternoon.
Deputy Ryan.
Thank you very much indeed, and apologies, Mr. McCarthy, I had to leave just momentarily to speak in the Dáil chamber there, but can I say just one broad reflection and then ask three questions? Very brief.
No reflections.
Questions, in other words.
Okay. What's your vision of the future of Irish forestry? Where will it be? What type of forestry will it be?
Just to be clear, forestry isn't within our remit as a department, so I can offer you my vision of forestry.
Your vision.
But the Department of Agriculture has policy responsibility for forestry.
I think the Department of Rural Community surely has a vision for future forestry.
I think we need to be realistic here about the responsibilities of each department. We have the appropriate department around forestry coming in next week. So, really, I mean, I think there is no point in addressing questions that are not relevant.
I disagree, Chair. I disagree.
Well, you're asking him for a personal view, and I really don't think it's appropriate.
Well, I can either offer a personal view, or I can suggest that we have a parallel policy, and we don't have a parallel policy.
Okay. So, what's the vision of the future of Irish forestry then, for rural Ireland?
Well, the policy responsibility for that rests with the Department of Agriculture.
I say that because people at Leitrim, I think, rightly think that it's just they've been sacrificed in terms of rural communities and a forestry policy that has a disregard for rural community development. And I think it's important that the department would have some view in that, so we start getting it right. And forestry is an important part. And I think to not have a view on that, which is one of the biggest rural issues of our day, is shocking.
But if I could offer a view there, Government decides on policy. The Department of Agriculture is responsible for bringing forward policy proposals to government. We get the opportunity to input into the development of policies. We get the opportunity to comment at government in relation to the development of policies across government departments that impact on rural Ireland. But we don't offer and we don't develop an alternative vision.
If you're commenting then on forestry policy, what would your comment be?
I don't have a comment to make.
I think what we need to clarify is which department has responsibility for planning. Is it your department? Is it your specific
in respect of
section?
forestry?
Of any planning? Is it because, I mean,
Well,
this
planning is a
issue, I
matter
think,
for the
is around
Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government.
So it's not your department?
Another direct question, if I can. What are the big greenway projects that are built today, and where is your plan around the development of greenways? What's the strategic role your department has in that regard, or vision your department has in that regard?
Minister Ross brought a greenway strategy to government recently, and that's a published strategy, so that's available, and it's available to the committee.
Is there any big,
and we fed into that.
Are there any big greenway projects that you're rooting for?
Well, for example, we would have been involved in the development of the Waterford Greenway, the one in Mayo. The name escapes me at the moment. So there are a number of greenway developments. We would our main role in relation to the greenways will be to, I suppose, to exploit the potential of the main greenway developments being funded by the Department of Tourism, Transport and Sport, and to offer opportunities to communities to link into those greenways through, I suppose, essentially tributary developments or smaller greenway developments that support that. But the main greenways developments, as set out in that strategy, are being led on by Minister Ross's department.
Can I say that when I read your documents, all I see is one for the everyone in the audience, hundreds of projects, grants here, there, everywhere, but nothing strategic or substantial. You 1.5 million already allocated in that rural environment team, but with 58 projects, it's an average 25 grand to go. It's just all small. It's all dotted all over the place with no strategic intent on it. An example of that would be town renewal, which we set out in the National Planning Framework as a key central objective. You have 6 towns where you're doing something. Where's the scale? Where's the strategic vision?
Just to clarify, on the town and village renewal, I was referring to a specific pilot which involves 6 towns. The town and village renewal programme has supported well over 600 towns since 2016.
But in your new pilot scheme, you have 6 towns.
Yeah.
What's happening in those towns?
Well, those towns have been identified as towns with particular development requirements, where we're going to work intensively with the local authority and the communities in those towns to support them in coming up with a feasibility plan, an action plan around what the requirements are for those towns to make them more attractive places to live.
What are those 6 towns, and how much money do you think would go into each of them? Roughly.
Well, the initial funding is for, I think it's 100,000 to support the development of that action plan. But ultimately, what we would see emerging from this is a plan of action for those towns, which will require much more significant investment in order to support them. At a strategic level, there's a 1 billion fund for rural regeneration now, provided for under the National Development Plan, and that gives us a real opportunity to make serious investments in towns such as those or elsewhere that come forward with really strong plans for regeneration, and that's where we would see.
What are the 6 towns?
That's where we would see.
What are the 6 towns?
I'll get you those.
Can I just clarify, Deputy, in relation to the Citizens' Assembly on climate action, which recommendation are you referring to, or what is it?
I believe the central part of our whole climate reaction is bringing life back to the core of our towns, so we stop the long-distance sprawl that has become a feature of our country. I think it's actually one of the most important.
Yeah.
I'd love to know what actually we're doing about it. What I hear is we've 100,000, which, to be honest, wouldn't do a street, let alone a town, in terms of any transition. I don't think there's any scale. And I'd love to know which towns.
There's serious scale in the 1 billion rural regeneration and development fund,
which is going everywhere.
And that gives us serious opportunity. The intention of this pilot is to, in the 6 towns involved, and I have the names of them here: Boyle, County Roscommon; Callan, County Kilkenny; Ballinrobe, County Mayo; Banagher, County Offaly; Castleblaney, County Monaghan; and Cappoquin, County Waterford. The 100,000 is to provide technical assistance to those towns to do survey works, to engage with the community, to develop up plans, and then to come back to us with seriously worked out plans around how you can transform the landscape in those towns to make them more attractive places for residential occupancy. So it's actually a highly ambitious undertaking, and we're undertaking it in those 6 towns because we want to try out new approaches. We want to find new approaches. We don't want to do more of the same, and that's where the opportunity lies in these. And the 100,000 is simply seed funding. There is the opportunity now with a new Rural Regeneration and Development Fund to scale up on a serious level.
Can I say, I know a lot of those towns, beautiful towns like Boyle, Bantry, Callan, all of them, and there's really interesting stuff going on. There's a really interesting project in Callan around housing, which would be superbly worth support. So, and I think your approach is right in terms of it's actually about engaging the community and so on. But what I fear we'd end up doing, we said in the National Planning Framework that was our key objective, and it was absolutely right to bring right back to the core of those, particularly those market 18th century, 19th century towns. And then we just disperse money to everything. You say there's $1 billion, there is. We should have focused it on building up those villages and towns as the centre of the revival of rural Ireland, in my mind, and we didn't. We dispersed it in the end, and that's why I think when I read here again, there's little bits of money everywhere. I think rather than 6 towns, you should be doing 60 or 600.
Yeah, and potentially the $1 billion has not been dispersed. There's a call for
promised everyone.
Sorry, it has not. There's a call for proposals out. The first call for proposals has been out. Not 1 penny or 1 cent of that $1 billion has been approved for allocation anywhere yet. So it's wrong to say that the $1 billion has been dispersed widely. We do see that as providing the opportunity for strategic investment to deliver on the national strategic outcomes that are set out in the National Planning Framework. So it is intended to support developments of scale. We're talking about proposals of €500,000 and above. That's the bar at which we're talking. And it's open to communities, towns and villages and their hinterlands, but towns and villages of less than 10,000 population, which is to align it with the alternative purpose of the urban fund, which also sits within that fund. So the intent here is to support high impact developments of scale that can have a real impact on the towns and villages that you're talking about. You're right to say that a lot of our investments so far, they are small scale. A lot of our programmes, that's the nature of them, but it's trying to get into the teeth of communities to make things happen. And it's supporting small projects, and there might be small projects, and it might be small money, and it might be dispersed, but it's having an impact up and down the country in terms of those small communities and the opportunities that they see through these various funding schemes.
Thank you very much, Mr McCarthy, and your officials for your presence here this afternoon. I'd like now to suspend the meeting for a minute to enable witnesses from the Office of Public Works to take their seats. And I'd like to welcome Mr Maurice Buckley, Chairman of the Office of Public Works, Mr John Sydenham, Commissioner, Kieran O'Connor, Principal Architect, Jim O'Sullivan, Chief Engineer, and Mark Adamson, Assistant Chief Engineer. Before we commence formal proceedings, I must first begin with some formalities and advise our witnesses on the matter of privilege. I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise and make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And now I'd like to invite Mr Buckley to make his opening statement.
I thank the Chairman and the Committee for the invitation to attend today and to brief the members on the activities of the OPW with respect to climate action. Just get the mechanics working here. There are 2 areas of work of the OPW that are particularly relevant to climate action, namely the estate portfolio management area, mitigating change by increasing the energy efficiency of our public building stock, and our flood risk management function, involving adaptation measures undertaken as a result of climate change. In relation to flood risk, projections indicate that climate change will have considerable impact on flood risk in Ireland. A rise in the mean sea level, together with increasing storm frequency, is being observed already, and this upward trend is projected to continue into the future, increasing the risk to our coastal communities, infrastructure and assets. It's projected that the number of heavy rainfall days per year will increase, along with potentially wetter winters, which could lead to an increase in flooding from rivers and urban flash floods, when intense rainfall events overwhelm the stormwater drainage networks. The projected wetter winters, particularly in the west of the country, could give rise to increased groundwater flooding associated with turloughs. These potential impacts of climate change are likely to have serious consequences for Ireland, where our cities and most of our main towns are located either on the coast or alongside our rivers. Under the remit of the National Climate Change Adaptation Framework in 2012, the OPW prepared a flood risk management climate change sectoral adaptation plan in 2015. That plan summarised the relevant science in climate change and the current state of knowledge with regards to its impact on flooding and flood risk in Ireland, and outlined the flood risk management adaptation practice in Ireland at that time. In May of this year, the Minister of State for the Office of Public Works and Flood Relief, Mr Kevin Boxer-Moore TD, launched the flood risk management plans. These plans are the final output from the National Catchment Flood Risk Assessment and Management, or CFRAM programme. This was the largest study of flood risk ever undertaken by the state and assessed the risks in 300 communities around the country that are home to approximately 3 million citizens, about two-thirds of our population, and about 80% of the properties potentially at risk from our primary source of flooding, namely rivers and the sea. While these 300 communities included all of our cities and almost all of our major towns, about half of the 300 areas studied were small, often rural communities with a population of less than 2,000 people. Key findings of the CFRAM programme were that some 34,500 properties within the 300 communities have been identified as being at risk from a significant flood event, but that there's an economic basis to invest in flood relief schemes to protect 95% of these properties to the 100-year standard for fluvial schemes, for river schemes, and the 200-year standard for coastal schemes. To do this, we need to design and construct another 118 flood relief schemes, in addition to the 42 already completed and the 33 that are underway. Up to €1 billion investment is required for this, and this funding is committed by the government through the National Development Plan to 2027. OPW is doubling its annual investment on flood risk management to approximately €100 million by 2021. The CFRAM programme and the presentation of the flood maps included in the assessment of risk for included the assessment of risk for two potential future scenarios, taking into account the potential impacts of climate change. These future scenarios include a rise in the mean sea level of 0.5 metre and 1 metre, and an increase in the peak flood flows in rivers of 20% and 30% for these two scenarios respectively. The flood maps for the 300 communities assessed under the CFRAM programme, including the future scenario flood maps, were published in May this year through our publicly accessible web portal, floodinfo.ie, and are being made available to the local authorities and other stakeholders to inform the preparation of their local and sectoral adaptation plans. They can also assist with future planning decisions and, very importantly, emergency response planning. The CFRAM maps complement strategic flood maps that cover the entire coastline of the country that were prepared under the Irish Coastal Protection Strategy Study. These maps, which include maps for the two potential future scenarios, are currently under review to take into account the most recently available observed data and also the coastal wave environment. Since May, together with the local authorities, the OPW has been moving into a detailed development and implementation for these 118 measures that include further detailed assessment of adaptability for future climate change. Hence, each individual scheme will be subject to an assessment within its own particular context, and as appropriate, provisions will be made in the design and construction of the schemes to cater for potential future changes. While substantial work has already been done in assessing the potential impacts of climate change for flooding and flood risk, the OPW will continue to engage across sectors of government and with the climate science research community to help inform and monitor the evolving state of knowledge with regards to climate change. Turning now to the estate portfolio management side. The role of the OPW in property is largely focused on providing property solutions, accommodation solutions to central government departments and to other state organisations. In 2009, as part of the EU 2020 climate and energy objectives, Ireland set a national energy target of 20% for improvement in energy efficiency. While the overall national target was set at 20%, Ireland set a more ambitious target of 33% for improvements in the energy efficiency within its own public sector. The purpose of setting a more challenging target for the public sector is to demonstrate leadership on energy efficiency for the whole of the economy and society. The Public Sector Energy Efficiency Strategy, published by the Department of Communications, Climate Change and Environment in 2017, sets out the very significant achievements of the Irish public sector to date in improving its energy efficiency, with savings of 21% reported in 2016. However, the report also identifies the need for a step change in activity to reach the government's target of 33% by 2020. The built environment contributes significantly to total energy use, in the region of 40% of the overall. The savings reported for the public sector to date are a considerable achievement. A significant proportion of these savings has been realised through behavioural changes, the elimination of energy waste and low-cost capital projects. There is, however, a finite limit on how much can be achieved by these measures, and once reached, capital investment is necessary to make further savings, particularly in areas such as large-scale projects, including near-zero energy, new build and deep retrofit of existing buildings. The OPW devised and implemented a staff energy awareness programme called Optimising Power at Work, a play on OPW, in our portfolio of buildings. The level of engagement from staff across the sector has been exceptional, and considerable savings have resulted with relatively low level of investment. The majority of the existing inherited buildings in the OPW's portfolio provide accommodation, as I said, for the central government departments agency in the Gardaí, but there's also specialist facilities there, such as data centres, laboratories, museums, etc. And a good indication of the overall energy efficiency of these existing buildings can be found from analysing the operational BER in the display energy certs of the buildings. And the vast majority of these, about 79%, as you can see in the slide, have a rating of either C or D. On the upper end of the scale, only 10%, unfortunately, have a B rating or better, and at the lower end, 11% have an E rating or worse. The majority of the very poor performing buildings have exceptional electrical loads, such as, for example, a large data centre, or are historical properties. So the OPW has developed a three-step process with regard to increasing the energy efficiency in our building portfolio. Step one is about behavioural change, the elimination of waste and optimisation of existing controls. So the OPW has achieved average energy savings of approximately 18% through the Optimising Power at Work scheme. Launched in 2008, this campaign operates in 280 large central government buildings, covering approximately 80% of the energy usage across the whole OPW property portfolio. The main focus of the programme is to encourage behavioural change of building occupants, optimising existing control systems and eliminating energy wastage. There's three fundamental elements to this, which are technology. So you need to have availability of real-time energy reports, and this is done from energy monitoring equipment installed in each participating building. Then specialist resources, energy specialists working with and advising the energy teams in each building, and most important of all, staff engagement, where active involvement of staff in energy teams is put in place in each building. In 2014, the Department of Public Expenditure Reform, along with the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment, provided €9 million funding to expand the programme into the wider public sector. OPW are leading the campaign. However, the service requirement is largely outsourced to specialist private sector companies. The public sector campaign is now operating in 16 large acute care hospitals, 2 universities, 5 institutes of technologies, 10 local authorities, 9 prisons, 5 specialist facilities and 3 HSE estates administration buildings. The second step is about upgrading the mechanical and electrical systems. So there are significant energy savings to be achieved by upgrading existing mechanical and electrical systems, particularly in older buildings. Most buildings will benefit from upgrading of existing lighting systems, boilers and controls. These interventions can be carried out with minimum disruption to the normal operation of the occupants, and typical savings of 8 to 10% can be expected with payback periods of 8 to 12 years. In 2017, the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment provided €3.5 million in funding for an energy efficiency retrofit pilot programme in central government buildings. The programme was a joint venture between DCCAE, the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, SEAI, and the OPW. Last year, 11 large buildings were upgraded, mainly involving lighting and control projects, and this year, funding has been increased to €9.5 million, and energy retrofit programmes are currently underway in 33 large buildings. This year's retrofit programme includes boiler upgrades, control system upgrades and some fabric upgrades. These retrofits will lead to a significant electrical and thermal fuel saving. The OPW will closely monitor the level of savings achieved through the existing monitoring and reporting system. In addition to the above, DCCAE, through SEAI, has also provided €1 million in funding for a pilot energy works programme in a selection of smaller buildings. As part of this initiative, there are currently fabric, lighting and boiler upgrades being carried out in 28 smaller central government buildings. Substantial energy savings are being achieved in the buildings that were retrofitted in 2017, where we have the data. Typically, electrical usage and lighting has been reduced by 60 to 70%, with the overall electrical loads in those buildings being reduced by 20 to 40%. In order to meet the government's public sector energy targets, substantial investment to expand the energy retrofit programme in all large buildings within the OPW portfolio during 2019 and 2020 will be needed. The third step is deep retrofit. And deep retrofit is a combination of major fabric upgrades and M&E, mechanical and electrical system upgrades. Such works yield very significant reductions in energy usage. In effect, it involves stripping the building right back to its bare structure and installing very high-performing insulation and glazing systems, improving air tightness and installing high-energy mechanical and electrical systems, high-efficiency mechanical and electrical systems. It's not practical to carry out these works while buildings are occupied. So this type of intervention is only considered where it's opportune, when the building is being vacated for some reason. So the OPW has a number of buildings in the project pipeline that will be suitable for deep retrofit, such as the Tom Johnson House in Beggars Bush, Ballsbridge, and 22 Clare Street, both office refurbishments that are planned. A key part of the state's portfolio managed by the OPW relates to heritage sites, buildings, parks and gardens. The conservation and restoration works within these sites are undertaken with an emphasis both on conservation standards and energy conservation. The ability to upgrade the energy efficiency of a historic structure while maintaining the appropriate conservation standards can be seen in recently completed works, such as the refurbishment work to government buildings South Block on Marion Street. Then in terms of new buildings, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive requires Member States of the EU to ensure that after the 31st of December this year, all new buildings occupied and owned by public authorities are nearly zero energy buildings, NZEB. The directive provides that the public sector must lead by example in this regard. Revised Irish Building Regulations Part L for buildings other than dwellings were published in 2017. However, in order to satisfy the requirement that after the 31st of December 2018, all new buildings occupied and owned by public authorities are NZEB, an interim public sector performance specification was published on the 1st of January 2017. This involved the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, OPW and SEAI working together to formulate the specification. The OPW is currently designing all new buildings to the NZEB standard. Considerable work has been carried out by our design teams to ensure compliance with the new requirements, especially with regard to on-site renewable technologies, such as photovoltaics, heat pumps, solar thermal, etc. OPW has maintained a long-standing tradition of building design based on sustainability and energy efficiency. From the publication of the Green Design Sustainable Building for Ireland standard in 1996 to the recent completion of a number of building programmes. These programmes include 7 courthouse projects across the country, 3 large-scale Garda divisional or regional headquarter buildings, and the OPW Schools programme, all of which achieved BER rating of A3. Moving forward under the National Development Plan 2018 to 27, the OPW is charged with the delivery of a number of large-scale building projects, the design and construction of which will require compliance with the NZEB standard. In particular, the Forensic Science Laboratories at Backweston campus in County Kildare, the Garda Security and Crime Operations Centre for Military Road, Dublin 8, and the Leeson Lane office development will all be near zero NZEB buildings. So, in summary then, Chairman, the OPW has completed under the National CFRAM programme a detailed assessment of current and potential future flood risk. We're implementing a €1 billion programme of investment in flood risk schemes to protect people and property, taking into account the increases in flood risk that climate change can bring. OPW is playing a leading role in Ireland's compliance with public sector targets by ensuring that buildings within the property portfolio managed by the OPW are designed to comply with energy efficient standards. There's been substantial work done to date with regard to energy efficiency in central government buildings. Significant savings have been achieved, and the OPW will continue to work with our clients to help them maximise their energy efficiency. To continue to make these improvements, a significant capital investment to retrofit the remainder of OPW's building stock will be required over the coming years. Thank you,
Mr. Buckley. And now I invite Deputy Smith.
That was very, very interesting and a serious piece of work that you're undertaking. And what I would like to ask you are kind of just add-ons and a little bit looking into what the study you have done on the CFRAM. And the first thing I'd like to ask you is the same question I asked the last group that were in the Department of Rural Affairs, and that is, all of this has been designed and looked at and planned and worked out, I assume, prior to the IPCC report on climate change.
Correct.
And I'd like to ask you what impact you think that report would have on this. Does it ratchet up the seriousness and the urgency and the investment and the development of what you're trying to do here, which is really interesting and really worthwhile? But I would imagine that that report was like, you know, alarm bells going off. We need more investment. We need to do more, and need to do it sooner. And I'd like you to talk about that. And in line with that, you talk about a €1 billion investment required to design and construct 118 flood relief schemes. Do you think that investment is nearly enough? Do you think now, knowing what we know, that investment may need to be ratcheted up? Because you give us a sort of a hold on, if I get it out here. You give us a scenario that there could be a rise in sea levels of 0.5 of a metre to 1 metre, resulting in peak flood flows in the rivers of 20 or 30%. What are you basing that on? Like, where is that coming from? You didn't just pluck it out of the sky. And again, in line with the projections of climate change? Could that be more serious, and could that change? And therefore, would you need more of investment in what you're trying to do with the measures, the flood measures, etc.? Yeah. So the last question is kind of in line with that. That if we spend all this money, like it's say $1 billion, maybe 2, can you project from that what we actually might save? Number one, from the destruction and the loss of both life and property and damage to animals and the cities and towns and everything else that could happen. And number two, what we might save in terms of the penalties and the fines that could come hurtling down on top of us from Europe if we fail to reach the Paris targets. And are you concerned that setting a target for 33% of improvement in energy efficiency in the public sector isn't good enough in light again of the IPCC report?
Deputy Mr. Butler.
Okay, thank you for that, Deputy. I'll bring my colleague in a moment on the IPCC issue, the recent report on climate change. But first of all, the €1 billion investment is a good sum of money. We'd always welcome more, but it does allow us to put in place a very wide-ranging programme covering a very large portion of the schemes that can be economically justified at this point in time. So the climate change measures, the climate change impact will progressively arrive over the coming years. Nobody can say how soon. And as that happens, there's undoubtedly new investment will be required to extend the existing schemes and put schemes in place where they're not currently required or are not currently economically justified. The two scenarios I spoke about, the half-metre sea level rise with 20% increase in river flow, and then the 1 metre sea level rise with the 30% increase in river flow, have been selected on the basis of the climate change science and the best analysis with the experts in Ireland and internationally on the best assumptions, the best scenarios to take in this context. And I might ask Mark Adamson to come in there as to how that has been impacted by the recent UN report last week.
Thank you very much. We would have based the mid-range future scenarios and the high-end future scenarios, the allowances for changes in flows and sea level rise based on the science available at the time. When the assessment report 4 came out from the IPC in 2014, they would have supported the allowances that we'd made. And the recent 1.5 degree report, which I assume is what you're referring to there, the mid-range future scenario actually falls in the middle of the projected range of sea level rise that's projected in the 1.5 degree report, with the 1 metre sea level rise actually being above the projected range with a 1.5 degree global warming, and indeed a 2 degree global warming where there might be an additional 10 or 20 centimetres. So I think that our scenarios that we've used to assess our vulnerabilities and that we'll use going forwards to ensure that we're designing our flood relief schemes so they can cater for potential changes in future decades, I think they are reasonably robust.
Anything else, Deputy?
Yep.
Well,
just
yeah, I did ask the question.
Okay. Yeah. In terms of the payback then on the 1 billion investment or further investment, all of the schemes that I've spoken about, the 118 new schemes as well as the existing schemes, have to go through a very rigorous cost-benefit assessment, and they have to cut muster. Basically, in terms of obviously protection of human life, but also protection of property. So the primary criteria is the residential property that can be protected by any of the schemes. And then you have secondary benefits in terms of the quality of life in communities, agricultural benefits and so on. But each one of the schemes must meet the strict criteria we've put in place so there will be a payback, in other words, in excess of the cost we're investing.
And can we measure that to, per scheme or overall or approximate? In other words, there would be a very good argument to make for continual increased investment if we can show that each investment saves us in the long run, both financially and otherwise.
Yeah, did you want to come in then?
Well, just to say that each scheme individually is assessed in relation to its cost-benefit analysis. The benefit-cost ratio must be established and needs to be greater than 1. So the case is there that it's a sensible spending of taxpayers' money in terms that we will get a greater benefit than the cost invested.
And do you have that somewhere written on the 118 schemes, that sort of cost analysis of savings?
We do have it. It's in the flood risk management plans, which are available online in the www.floodinfo.ie website, and it's there in these plans for each and every scheme.
Okay, thanks very much.
Your last question then was in relation to the 33% target for the public sector. That is an ambitious target. I think it's very good that the public sector is leading the way, that we have a higher target to lead by example than the 20% national target for buildings. Whether that, in the short term, I think to reach that by 2020 will be a huge challenge. Whether it can be extended really is a question for government and a question for how much funding can be made available and where that is prioritised. The public sector accommodation is a relatively small percentage of the overall energy use in the state, so one has to prioritise where the investment is put. But certainly we would consider 33% a good target, a challenging target. We would be working very hard to lead the way on that. I think we are, and I think other public bodies are working towards that as well. I think we need to reach that target first, maybe before we extend it.
Okay, Margaret.
Thank you very much. Deputy Butler.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found it very, very helpful. Just in summary, the OPW is the lead public body for flood risk management through CFRAM. And I just want to say I did find your community workshops and engagements when you did travel the country. I know now it was about 18 months ago, but I found them to be very, very useful. And there was a lot of people who live on, I would be from the Sure River area, that they did find them very, very useful. So I would just like to say that at the outset.
Thank you.
I think, in fairness, looking back over recent years, that an awful lot of policy, through no fault of anyone's, was probably more reactive than proactive, because when an area flooded and the devastation this caused and the upset to residents and businesses and insurance costs, obviously you have to act then. And I suppose with the new findings of the CFRAM programme, this will probably be much more proactive going forward to try and mitigate issues. I think that's the whole purpose of it.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
I think to date, most, if not all, of the schemes that we put in place have been triggered by serious flooding events, or they're in towns where there have been a number of flooding events, and that it still will be some time before we fully catch up. But by the end of this programme, we definitely will be anticipating the possibility of flood events in towns that haven't, thankfully, have had a history of bad flooding.
Okay, thank you. So the 300 communities that you have identified as being at risk from a significant flood event, can I ask, of these 300 communities, would there be any of those that are standalone, say single dwelling, for example? Now, I would have dealt with an issue in my own town where I live, and thankfully through the minor work scheme that has now been resolved. Hopefully, you can never say for definite, but you know, a small grant was achieved and the works were done. But I just found sometimes when it's a single dwelling and it's maybe right at the location of the mouth of a river or at the basin or wherever, sometimes I found those residents didn't have as much of a voice, especially if they were elderly, compared to, say, if a whole village or town flooded. You know the point I'm trying to make? That sometimes it's more difficult. I find the minors' work grant has been successful when it has been applied, but sometimes people found it difficult, without going through a politician maybe, to try and find the information they needed to work through their local authority to access the grant. Another question I wanted to ask you, when flood defence schemes are put in place, there is a perception out there, and you might address this, and I'm just saying it's a perception, I'm not saying it's there. For example, you showed the picture of Clonmel there, and there's actually been a very, very successful flood defence scheme put in place in Clonmel. But if you were to speak to people in Carrick-on-Suir, which subsequently flooded a few years later, there's a perception out there that when you solve the problem in one town, that you push it further down. And I'm sure you've heard that back yourselves. And, like, you might address that as well, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. There's a couple of questions there. First of all, in terms of the single houses or smaller communities, I guess there's kind of a hierarchy of how the protection works. Obviously, we're prioritising the schemes that will bring the most benefit to the highest number of people and highest number of properties, and also the cost benefit is obviously easier to achieve if you're putting in a large investment if there are 50 houses that will be saved from flooding as a result. So the high level schemes that we described in CFRAM are at that national level of the big investment. Then, as you quite rightly point out, the next level down is working with the local authorities on the minor works. And there's a large number of schemes there as well, and they're more flexible and more locally focused, but they still have to meet the cost-benefit analysis. I might ask Commissioner Sydenham here just to explain, there are possibilities, you do come down then to single houses or 2 or 3 houses that are built in a floodplain, where it's just not possible to economically justify a large-scale work. And we do have 1 or 2 schemes that can be applied there that you might just explain, John.
I think that captures it. I think the individual development is always going to be a problem, and given the sort of demographics in this country, you've got an awful lot of what you call ribbon development, the length and breadth of the country. That's always a challenge to try and protect that. Now, that said, it is equally as a motive for any individual impacted by flooding, whether you're part of a town or you're living in an isolated bungalow. But I think the key argument is the economic argument. We can't devote very scarce resources to do an elaborate scheme to protect houses. We've looked at instances where the cost of a remediation would be multiples of the value of the dwelling we're trying to protect. So it's, even though it sounds very heartless, the economic realities come in. That said, we've looked at a number of measures that can assist individuals impacted like that. We have individual property protection, whereby depending on the extent of the flood impacting on the dwelling, you can get devices that can protect them in terms of water ingress. Pumping is another thing that can be done. And beyond that, I think we have looked at home relocation, which again is an extreme, but I think you have instances where it's not economically viable or prudent or practical to do something with the existing dwelling. So we have a scheme developed, which government have approved, which facilitates somebody moving to a new location and constructing a new dwelling. Now, that's an extreme for someone who's lived in a community for a protracted period. In other areas where you have small groupings of houses which effectively may not warrant a full scheme, we have other schemes whereby we've developed what we call a localised individual property protection, but part of that, I think one of the key issues with them is you need a very sophisticated warning system so that you have ample time to put the measures in place. And I think we've looked at we piloted a number of those schemes, and we found that the cost of the warning system exceeds the cost of the remediation. So some of these can be extremely expensive. And then, as you've mentioned yourself, we have the minor work scheme. So I think there are a range of measures for people. Now, maybe based on what you said, is our communication could improve so that people do know what's available to them, and that's something we could take on board. Your other question, in terms of then the example you gave, was Corcoran Shore, that there's a perception, and I use the word perception, and we see this all the time, that we fix a problem in one area and it's literally dislocated downstream or to somebody else. I think that's the one key centre aspect of the CFRAM programme, is we looked at catchments and the interactions within the catchment, so that one intervention in one area doesn't cause a problem elsewhere. And that's central to that. So even though people may think that, it doesn't happen. The schemes are designed specifically to ensure there's no knock-on impact.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Heydon.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the officials for coming in and your patience having to wait earlier on after the first presentation. There's a lot of detail in that, and obviously CFRAMs is something that was very much designed to be future-proofed. So we'd hope in a lot of ways that the IPCC report wouldn't completely throw it out of the water, but I think it is fair to ask, are there extra measures that are required arising from the ICC report, and how that and the impact that will have? You know, will any of the flood relief schemes need to be augmented that exist at present, or does the OPW feel the need to review any of the current plans that are there? Do you see a situation where, let's say, existing flood barriers would have to be made higher or anything like that because of these projections? And then just in relation to the 118 flood relief schemes required to be completed that were announced, what's the specific timeline on that? And we're talking 10 years, but if you could give us as much specifics as you have around the delivery of them, and have they been prioritised in a list of where you start and are you doing more than one at a time, and who'll be first and who'll be last is obviously whatever area we want to know. Can I ask then just a different area? And I'm not ignoring your presentation, it was really interesting, but because it was so in-depth, I don't feel needs to ask questions on the buildings bit, because it's really good to see, and we drive past Kevin Street Garda Station every day and it's so impressive. So, you know, it's great to see the steps you're taking on the BER levels of existing buildings and new buildings. In relation to car parks, obviously OPW would have a lot of car parking space with all their buildings, most of their buildings would have car parks, and public sector buildings will be required to develop EV charging infrastructure, and it's just to see how many of your car parks would have EV charge points, and are there plans to roll out more of these from 2019 and onwards, and you know, in terms of major refurbishments been undertaken by the OPW, has ensured that there's appropriate ducting in place to allow for the installation of electrical vehicle charging points down the line as well? Are you trying to future-proof any works you're doing? Are you cognizant of the fact that hopefully in the future we'll have an awful lot more electric cars on the road? So that was just another area I'd like to...
Okay, thank you, Deputy. So to take questions in order, you asked about the impact of climate change and what we will do. So, as explained, we were working with two scenarios, the half-metre sea level rise and the 1 metre sea level rise. And each of the 118 schemes, and the other schemes already designed, we're looking what will happen and what would have to change if and when that takes place. And it varies scheme by scheme. Sometimes it might be to design a physical defence strong enough that if it had to be increased by a few 100 millimetre 50 years or 100 years down the road, that it could be without further intervention. For example, sometimes it can be done right now. For example, in Clonakilty, there's a major scheme just being put in place at the moment involving relief channels around the town, and they're being designed so that they would have capacity for at least the mid scenario, if not the extreme scenario of the higher flow rates. So there wouldn't need to be a further intervention. And in some situations, you'll need to start again and introduce new interventions if and when those extremes arise. And of course, nobody knows when. I mean, we talk roughly of a timeline of 2100, but it could be sooner, it could be later. So each individual scheme is different. Then you asked about the timeline for the programme. So the programme is dictated by the capacity available in the market to build all these schemes and the funding, and both are reasonably well aligned. We have the €1 billion over the 10 years of the National Development Plan, and that has been targeted out now. All those 118 schemes have been planned, along with the completion of the schemes currently in train. And that will absorb pretty much all of the appropriate civil engineering and design capacity that the country has. There's quite a capacity clinch in the market, because obviously it's a lot of the same companies that will be building buildings and everything else. So there is a plan there. As I mentioned in the presentation, we would project to increase our annual spend from roughly 50 million a year at the moment to 100 million a year by 2021, which is only 3 years' time. In terms of prioritisation, we prioritise those 118 schemes on the basis of the benefit, the number of houses protected really, and the cost benefit. So there are 50 high priority schemes, and then the plans have been worked up for every other area. So, as mentioned, this floodinfo.ie site will allow you to see in detail the plans for every county in Ireland and every region, and what's been prioritised.
EVs?
Yeah, the EVs. At the moment, In car parks and public buildings, we have very few electric vehicle charging points and very low demand for them. So we have, I suppose, like others, been waiting for the standards and charging points to come into line and firm up. Before I joined the OPW, about a year and a half ago, I was head of the national standards body and working very closely with the European counterparts on standards for charging points and connections and so on. So all of our new buildings will have electric vehicle charging points, and on existing buildings our policy is where there's a demand there from the occupants of the building, we will facilitate that demand and put charging points in place. But it is surprisingly low at the moment. You would expect a higher level of demand, but certainly in terms of ducting and facilities, and the design would be in place to make it relatively easy to install those charging points.
Thanks. If I could just make one small point on that, absolutely accept the standards need to come in to help lead the way. Demand, I think the one area about electric cars is going to be that demand will, people will think of electric cars when they see there's a charging point in their workplace. So there's probably an element of us needing to lead the way a little bit on that as well. There's no criticism of the OPW, I'm just speaking in general terms. I think that when people say at the minute people are saying there's no point in buying an electric car, there's nowhere to charge it. Yes. So the one would lead on to the other, and it's something just that I would ask in any future planning or in any works that you're carrying out in car parking spaces, that you would make sure the infrastructure where it can be put in is put in to allow for them to be expanded, because I expect that'll all happen very quickly and they will be playing catch up.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Ryan.
Very much indeed. The new Energy Efficiency Directive, which was signed off in July this year, I think sets a higher target Europe for 2030 at 32.5%. And if I recall right, and I was trying to look for it frantically, the text, does it set not set specific requirements for public buildings to be more ambitious and ahead of the game? And it's disappointing that we're 10 percentage points away from our own energy public. I'll be honest. Do you know what? Have you any sense internally what your target is for 2030? Now.
Well, we're focused, I suppose, very much at the moment on the near-term target of the 33% we already have, which is ahead of that 32.5 for general buildings. And we certainly want to reach that target for OPW buildings, OPW-occupied buildings. And it will take a major effort and a major investment, which it probably isn't foreseen at the moment, to bring the whole OPW portfolio of Garda stations, office buildings to the 33%. And obviously, if we don't quite reach it in 2020, we'll want to keep going and reach it in 2021 or 22. So the targets beyond that, Kieran, do you have any comment on that?
I think all the newer buildings we're doing, Deputy, will be hitting that standard, and the deep retrofit programme that we plan to do. The crux, I think, with the deep retrofit is the funding available to manage the deep level of deep retrofit.
Yeah. You don't have a target for 2030 yet? I presume you will get it. Okay. No. How much of the deep retrofit, or what budget within the National Development Plan envelope do you have for deep retrofitting of public buildings?
We have the option. There's a number of projects that the Chairman has already mentioned that we're working on, like Tom Johnson and other Clare Street. So we're programming those as pilots and exemplars, and then we'll be sharing all that information with the rest of the public service and the private sector for how to achieve that.
But you don't have a budget for deep retrofit?
No. We don't have a specific additional budget for deep retrofit. What we will do is, first of all, every new building will be NZEB, but also every refurbishment. Our maintenance programmes, as buildings come to end of life, or as we relocate groups of people, civil service, from one building to another, we would retrofit that building to NZEB standard or A2 standard if we can.
Is it your expectation that your budget for deep retrofit, and deep retrofit is where we need to go now, you've done all the behavioural stuff, you haven't done any of the real deep physical stuff yet, and that's the scale. Given where we're going, zero emissions on energy use and everything in a decade or two, we've got to deep retrofit everything. Your budget for deep retrofit will come out of, is it your expectation it will come out of that 3 billion in the National Development Plan that's been set aside for retrofit?
Jim?
There are discussions going on at the moment with DEEPR and the Department of Climate Action. and environment on a wider public sector programme. And very significant monies are being discussed as part of that. It is at, I suppose, fairly early stages really in trying to get a picture of what the entirety of the budget will be.
Okay.
So
whenever you have an idea of that, it would be good to know. I'll come back to the floods, and I have a brief, Chairman. I appreciate you coming in. Our advisor from Maynooth made a very good point that we always need to make sure that when we're doing mitigation measures, we also take adaptation in mind. On the flood prevention, can I use that analysis in a different way, that when we're doing flood protection measures, we should be looking at nature protection at the same time? There is widespread concern that the flood protection measures that OPW engaged in are being highly destructive of natural systems. I could cite many examples, but the current one, maybe that drawing most attention, is the Blackwater flood management near Bandon, where on a daily basis we're seeing major trucks driving up and down rivers in the middle of most sensitive spawning scene. The whole river's thrashed. It's absolutely destroyed. Why are you doing flood management measures in a way that are destroying the rivers that we're seeing? The Blackwater is not an unimportant river.
Yep. Well, all of the works, they can be invasive. Sometimes they have to be invasive because of the nature of the measures that are needed to afford protection. But all of the works are done with as much environmental planning, as much sensitivity to environmental concerns as possible. We'd work closely with the IFI and the fisheries and try and work around spawning seasons. We'd conduct all the environmental assessments, look after the ecology to every extent possible. We do also look at other measures that try and solve the problem differently, and there are schemes. For example, Clonakilty I mentioned already. We're talking about storing water in floodplains, so that when there is a flooding event, you instead of deepening channels and so on, you're letting the water run into areas where it's not causing damage and not impacting the environment, and then run off when it can again. But there are limits to how much can be achieved with these natural measures, forestation, different things. So we do look at them, and they are part of our long-term planning. But experience nationally and internationally shows that there are limits there, and you can't get away from the need of fairly aggressive, maybe at times, physical interventions, which are unfortunate, and they are disruptive, and they do interfere with kind of riverways and so on. But as I say, it's done in as sensitive a way as we possibly can, and we manage the environmental issues very, very carefully.
Last question, if I can, Chair. Those IPPC reports on sea level rise are actually very conservative in my mind. It's an amalgamation of and there are some very serious senior scientific advisors now saying even the latest report may underestimate the potential risk of much higher sea level rise. But even if they're accurate, and if you think in a longer time trajectory, it's not stopping at 2050 or 2100. It's keeps going. And what we've already put in the atmosphere is almost guaranteeing a further higher sea level rise. In that regard, can you remind me, why is it that the OPW are opposed to what seems to me the very sensible proposal for a Cork tidal barrage to address the acute issue of flooding in Cork city centre, and rather than destroying the characteristic of Cork city centre with the current plans for raising city walls and destroying effectively the whole central, most attractive part of Cork, why is it that you're objecting to and not thinking big and long term in terms of supporting the calls for and looking and investigating the benefits from instituting a tidal barrage in Cork, which will protect the city into the next century as well as this one?
Yeah, we're not opposed to a tidal barrage in Cork in the long term, and actually think that probably will be part of the long-term protection needed in the event of a half-metre or 1 metre sea rise. It's just at this point in time the investment needed isn't justified, and the current flood risk in Cork is better protected with the package of measures that are planned, which will be needed anyway in conjunction with a tidal barrage, because we're dealing in Cork, as you well know, with the combination of fluvial as well as tidal risk there. So both go together. So our anticipation would be that the current measures will give protection in Cork for quite a period of time, but it's recognised that at some point in the future, and I might ask you to come in on this, John, we will reach a point where a tidal barrier or some form of sea protection is necessary in addition.
In the interregnum now, where your planning application has had to be withdrawn in Cork because was it the courts or whatever who decided recently, do we not have the opportunity to consider in real detail whether we might be not better investing now for the long term and looking at what the fluvial and also tidal issues were, and look at the option of providing that tidal barrage before we proceed with a plan that's highly contentious and in my mind won't even do the job, because water is still going to come up from the ground in Cork in some of the key sensitive areas.
Yeah, we're looking at those issues. Maybe, John, you might be able to explain in more detail.
I think, to come back to the necessity of a tidal barrier, OPW has never ruled that out and has just been mentioned. In the future, we probably will need a tidal barrier, but in terms of building infrastructure of that scale, it will not be needed for approximately 50 years or even longer. And nobody builds that scale of infrastructure today and wait 50 years before, because it's obsolete by the time you get around to using it. But I think the key issue is it only protects you against half the problem. You still have the fluvial aspect, which will need defences within the city. And again, I fully appreciate that people have differing views. We've looked at this. It's been done sensitively. I think the interventions are modest. A lot of the work to the quay walls are necessary, regardless of what your view is. A lot of them are crumbling. And I think there is, as you say, there has been issues in terms of the City Council's Part 8 planning application, which they've withdrawn. They'll be going back into a Part 10 process, which will go through the normal channels and go through in Bord Planola. So people will have another opportunity to voice their concerns.
Can I finish by saying I wish we'd started thinking 50 years ahead now and investing appropriately. I don't think that's even long term. I think we should be acting now for what's going to happen in 50 years' time, and I regret that the OPW isn't thinking that way.
Just one last point I'd make on that is we've looked at this in huge detail with the best international advice, and our estimate of a tidal barrier today is €1 billion. And with respect, we wouldn't be prepared in terms of cost efficiency to invest that type of money in an asset that we would not need for 50 years.
And there is another point, Deputy, as well, your own point about the impact on the environment and the Blackwater and so on. A tidal barrier is not without its impact as well. It has to have a flood area behind it and has a fairly huge ecological impact that has to be studied and taken into account. So between a combination of, I know these are very sensitive issues in Cork, and I see Deputy Sherlock there beside you smiling at me, but we are looking at those considerations. Although we're not ignoring them, we're not being stubborn on this. It's just that when you look at the combination of the economic pros and cons together with the environmental impact, the conclusion, and it's not just the OPW conclusion, it's the conclusion of experts nationally and internationally, that the way we are progressing this is the correct way for the city.
I think Cork is worth it.
Senator Mulhern.
Thank you. The dub still is, what's
Mulhern.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to say, as somebody who engaged with the CFRAM programme through its different stages up till the point we are now, I'd like to compliment the OPW and the consultants it's engaged. I was very impressed by the breadth of science and technology that was brought to bear and the plans that have been produced, because I live in an area that's been my own hometown. Ballina was flooded, and people are obviously, homes were destroyed and so on, and I was very impressed by it and its futuristic approach and its future proofing. And none of us know the future, but I think there were certain parameters that were put forward: 20 years, 50 years, 100 years planning, and I think that the best effort has been made to try and come up with plans that are reasonable and affordable, and I just want to say that part of it. Last May 2018, the Minister announced the at-risk areas that would proceed with flood defences, and there were 118, and then 50 were prioritised. Now, I'd like to think at this stage that, you know, we could get some progress report about how these are progressing, because every winter that comes, there's a fear hanging over communities that have been devastated by flood. And I think we need to have this being pushed on as quickly as possible within all the power and resources that OPW have. I'd also like to say, because I feel, notwithstanding the fact that there are areas that need flood defences, that it is an area that has been prioritised. And I suppose with particular reference to December 2015, November 2015, there were considerable floods around the country. Again, not just Ballina, where I'm from, but Crossmolina out the road, another town, absolutely devastated the whole centre of the town there. A lot of funding was put into it, minor work schemes, pilot projects on flood defences. A lot has been done. Unfortunately, we're bearing witness to the terrible weather events that happen and the impact and the ramifications are having. But I'd like to think that you are to the fore there, and that the issue now is to try and progress the schemes. So that's my first question. In relation to progress under CFRAMs, and in particular Ballina, could you tell me, it's one of the priority projects, schemes, what progress are you making now that we've identified what's a priority?
Okay, well, point taken, and certainly as you mentioned Crossmolina there, I know there...
I want to mention that because I know it's not under CFRAM, so...
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there is a particularly innovative scheme planned for Crossmolina,
yes,
which is going through consultation at the moment. Hopefully will bring relief. Would one of you be able to update particularly on Ballina?
Okay, I would have been at the meeting specifically in relation to Ballina, but I do know that meetings with the local authorities within whose jurisdiction each of the medium and large prioritised schemes are located, meetings have already been held to look at setting up the steering groups and progressing those. So we are progressing on each of the large and medium schemes that were identified as being a priority. Now, it does take a bit of time following on from the CFRAM to get all of that set up, for the briefs to be written, out to consultation, out to tender, and so on. But a meeting has been held.
Okay.
To
but
get
just to know the stages, so does it require now detailed design and then
yes.
a planning application? Is that,
okay,
is that what
yes.
you're saying?
I mean, CFRAM programme was a strategic national programme. So it undertook the assessments of the risk and undertook an appraisal of the various options that might be available to address that risk. But it didn't go to the level of detailed design and planning. So the stage we're at now is that we have these measures. They have been prioritised. And for each of them, then, we need to go through a stage of detailed scheme development so that we're ready to go through either Part 8 or Part 10 planning or through public exhibition, after which then we'll go to the detailed civil and structural design and then the tendering for contractors for construction.
And what's the timeline on that type of?
Unfortunately, it can take a while to implement these schemes. They tend to be in urban centres. They are fairly large and complex civil projects. And I think it's very important that we get them right. We don't try and rush through them.
I think probably the best thing is if we come back to you separately and specifically on Ballina. I don't think we have the information
That's
to hand.
grand. I'd appreciate if you would.
The Senator mentioned the various stages that each of the schemes are at, so maybe if you could bring that to the clerk of the committee and then it can be circulated to everybody. Is that right? Did you have another further question?
It was basically, I wanted to ask you about
Forgive me, Senator and Chair, can I just beg your indulgence? I'm up on a topical issue now. Is it okay if because I understand that I'm to speak next, is it okay if I go and take the topical issue and come back again?
Do you want to make way to him? Because
No, I'm not asking that at all. I'm just anxious that
to come back now. If the machine, like if everybody is, if we're still here.
I'm just anxious that I would be allowed, that the committee would facilitate me when I do come back.
Oh, no bother.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. You'll still be here. That's
as long as we're
that's
here,
what I'm asking.
we look after you. Don't worry.
So take your time, Michelle.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well,
Subject to the chair. She's watching. I wanted to get some more information about the Crossmolina scheme and the flood defence plant there. I'm very concerned that Crossmolina and the need for a scheme has been established for quite a number of years. Consultations have been going on since 2013-2014. I know that the statutory public consultation was undertaken during the summer, and we were honoured with your presence, Mr. Buckley, as well, and other people from OPW. My understanding is that we won't see the different stages that it now must proceed through completed until Q4 2019. Now, in all honesty, Mr. Buckley, at this stage, people in Crossmolina are pretty angry and frantic because I think the week before last, they nearly had a flooding event again. Now, I want to acknowledge the minor works schemes that were put in place and the efforts of locals. But you have now businesses in the centre of town which have been destroyed before. They have no flood insurance. This is it if they get flooded again. And you're talking about 2 winters basically, because if this is approved by Q4 2019, you're not going to start doing works in the middle of winter. It's going to be put back until spring at the earliest. So you're going to have this threat hanging over people for 2 winters. Now, I would like to know, in relation to the process and the planning process underway at the moment, when will ye, as the commissioners, have a report before the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform that they can go through their part of this? Has a screening been done of the project? What stage are we at in relation to a strategic environmental assessment? I mean, so much work has been done on this, so much has been talked about, funding is there for it, and it's poor solace to people at this stage that we're going to tell them, you're on the list, you are a priority, you have funding, and they're none the better for wear with the way things are proceeding. I think this has to be at a point next summer, as far as I'm concerned, that somebody is going in doing work there, and that they're not facing 2 winters, because they are facing this winter as it stands. And then just one other point, because I'll roll it in together. Yeah, it's just a question. I want to know to what extent you are having engagement with Department of Finance, Department, and also the insurance companies about a situation where you have built flood defences, people have had no insurance because of the flood threat, and now you have, taxpayers' money has been spent on these flood defences, which to date have done the job of work they've been put in place to do. Again, commend people for that. But people are having problems getting insurance. And I'm just wondering what engagement and what science and what engagement you've had with these insurance companies, and how is this going to be resolved?
Okay, 2 very good questions, and I do appreciate the point that for all the investment that's planned and the programme that's in place, it is very difficult for communities who every winter face an extreme flood risk like in Crossmolina. John, you might be able to take both of those points actually in detail.
Okay, if I start with Crossmolina, as you mentioned, the environmental impact assessment report was completed in May of this year. The statutory consultation process, the public consultation, is being finalised as we speak, and we expect to have the outline scheme to the Minister before the end of this year. With all things being equal, there's a statutory process that the Minister for Deeper has to go through. But all things being equal, we would expect to be proceeding to construction mid-2019. That's the envisaged.
You would proceed
to
construction, so you'd have it completed by, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's a 1 kilometre long channel with safety for children and everything else, fencing, so there's quite a lot involved, yeah.
But I think the key event is to get the scheme confirmed and then move to the procurement and proceed to construction. And the estimated commencement of construction is mid-2019.
That's great.
Okay. So, have you something else?
On the insurance, OPW has what we call a Memorandum of Understanding with the Insurance Federation, which is the umbrella body for insurance companies within the country. Now, while we don't have any direct responsibility in the area of insurance, what we do is we provide information to the Insurance Federation on schemes which we've completed, showing the level of protection we're affording properties in those catchments, and on the basis of that, they undertake to provide insurance. So that's the umbrella agreement we have with that sector.
Very good. Chair, could I just... it's just to say...
2 more people waiting now.
Deputy Ryan talked about, environmental considerations maybe being a bit that they mightn't be handled as sensitively as possible. I mean, we have a clear issue in Crossmolina where properties were being flooded, but because of freshwater pearl mussel, this is cited by the OPW, they wouldn't go in and dredge it, and yet people's homes and lives and businesses been destroyed. So I can't relate to any of the experiences been talked about there. We're constrained by designation all the time.
Senator O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation. And the NZEB, the buildings are very impressive. I just wondered, is there an opportunity to micro-generate around those buildings? So is there any plans to solar, whatever, to capture energy and then feed it back into the system so that you could be showing leadership? Because you can see, you know, your presentation is excellent and progressive in certain areas, but maybe other areas not so.
Well, we look at all of those options.
Yeah.
Senator, in a project. So, for instance, in Kevin Street, there's photovoltaics on the roof that provide all the water for showers and stuff like that. So it depends on the building. If it's a 24-hour building where you can get a good return, we would look at it in a different way than a building that's 9 to 5.
And do you think you could feed back into the grid? Could we move in that direction?
Well, I think so. I mean, Jim and ourselves have been looking at those options.
Well, I suppose under the NZEB requirements, there is a requirement for renewable energy in every building. Well, you need to consider it on a cost-optimal basis, and I would think that to satisfy the requirements of NZEB, practically all new buildings are going to have some level of photovoltaic. In urban locations, particularly high-rise buildings, it's difficult to have a substantial amount of it because the actual space isn't available. Normally roof space is limited, and therefore the amount of photovoltaic you're going to have on an individual building is going to be used within the building, and it's not going to be feeding back into the grid by and large. In other locations throughout the country, different opportunities will present itself. There again, I suppose you'd want a very, very substantial amount of photovoltaic in a modern building to have surplus. But if you have, well, yes.
I'm just thinking of it in terms of Ireland taking a leadership role and yourselves.
But what we also do, Senator, is that we, in a situation where the renewable element, like Jim has mentioned, for an inner city area where you have a restricted area to develop, what we do is we improve the rest of the performance of the building. So, for instance, the glazing element or the levels of insulation are increased to compensate or add additional. And that's something we got brought into the regulation as part of the OPW input with the Department of Environment. So I think that's a big plus, and we'll see the benefit of that in the next 5 to 10 years.
I just have a few other quick questions. How many catchment management schemes do you have, are you engaged in to reduce the speed of water runoff into the rivers causing flood risk? That's one question. I just have 3 more to follow.
All out together, sure.
Yeah, what budget has been allocated to this sort of catchment management in the National Development Plan? How many room for the river type schemes are being developed? This being the best practice in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, that I'm very familiar with. And what examination has the OPW made of the contribution of peatland drainage to flooding risks? And the last question, what peatland rewetting is included in the OPW's flood relief plans?
Okay. In terms of the National Development Plan investment, it's just under €1 billion, I think 940 million over 10 years towards the flood risk defences. In terms of the technical questions, I might ask Mark to comment. The first one was reducing the speed of runoff into rivers, and then the Nijmegen example of
Because I suppose if you look at the topography in Ireland, I'm living in Tremor in County Waterford, and down comes the water into, the answers.
No, we have been looking into this type of measure. Certainly there are pilots and research around that demonstrate for small floods, and particularly in small catchments where pilots have been undertaken, they can be quite effective in reducing flood peaks. Unfortunately, equally, there's research which indicates that the benefits of this type of measure for large events, say the 100-year flood or the 1% annual exceedance probability flood, reduces because effectively the catchment and everything is saturated already. And that, I suppose, lack of evidence at present is acknowledged in the EU policy document on natural water retention measures. So what we're looking at doing at the moment, and we have a research project that we're looking at co-funding with the EPA in exactly this type of area, is to try and develop the evidence base to allow us to proceed with significant investments in these types of measures. So it is something that we are pursuing, but that we haven't implemented at a micro scale to date, although, as the Chairman indicated previously, we do have some schemes in hand which are looking at storing water rather than defending and conveying. Just in relation to room for the river, I'm aware that certainly within the Netherlands and other countries on continental Europe, it is a very popular approach where they are moving back the dikes. I suppose the situation in Ireland is that the river already has the room, and we hear a lot of complaints from the farmers that, well, can't we protect the farmland? There's very, very short reaches of river in Ireland where they're embanked with flood protection defences. So it is an approach that we can apply because we already have, the river already has that space to flood out and attenuate and store those floodwaters already.
But not, you know, like what in areas, I mean, I'm just thinking of areas where there are embankments and that, and if you think of the Nijmegen example, you know, how they integrated the environment and the river system and flow, and, you know, they've offset a load of potential problems.
Absolutely.
Is there an opportunity in Ireland to look at that?
Yeah, well, we fully recognise the point. When we are looking at flood protection where it's necessary, we tend to keep the defences, be it a dike, an embankment or a wall, as far back from the river and as close to the assets and properties and people that we're trying to protect as possible. So when we're developing the scheme, we're already trying to optimise the room that's being left for the river, notwithstanding the fact that defence is there. But one thing we are becoming increasingly conscious of as well is the public realm aspect, that if we're becoming involved with a significant infrastructural development scheme, then in association with that we need to be looking at, well, how else can we be developing the public realm, and are there multiple benefits that can be generated through the implementation of that those works? Thank you.
Deputy Pringle, you're okay. Deputy Murphy.
Buchas Cathaoirleach, and first of all, welcome to Morris. We know each other pretty well over a number of years. You're in a very successful business in Roscommon. You still live there like myself, so we're both so busy. We usually meet outside Roscommon in places like Dublin. So, can I just again look? You know, considering the weather experiences we've had over recent years, I would have to compliment the OPW on a lot of the work they've done, because, you know, it's extraordinary. We had a lot of flooding, a lot of damage done, as you well know, Chairman. And on our own local radio station a couple of weeks ago on Shannonside Radio, I heard a warning about the low water levels on the River Shannon, a complete change in a short space of time in a season. So it is, I have to accept, difficult for agencies to deal with situations like that and take everything into consideration. I have a few questions that I'll go through as quickly as possible. First of all, the 1 billion, Morris, that you referred to, is that ring-fenced for the period of the 10 years? It's a significant amount of money, but is it totally ring-fenced and guaranteed that is there in terms of dealing with what could be emergencies, let's face it, and other areas that need to be dealt with? Secondly, I understood that the government put money into a relocation scheme. Can I ask you if that's correct? How many applications you've got and how many people have been relocated? Again, if you haven't all that information today, I accept, and you can come back to me. Also, the study of Turloughs, which I understand, Chair, would take a number of years to carry out. I think they are in progress, particularly I'm talking about two in Roscommon at the moment. I presume that they are in progress at the moment. And when do we envisage that we will have a report on those? Thirdly, have we got a maintenance budget, particularly for the River Shannon? We've heard a lot of talk about pinch points, and I'm sure, Maurice, you travel across the bridge in Lanesborough many a day, and you see the abhorrent growth that has come there that never was there. I fished as a young lad there, and we never had that growth, which is causing a lot of annoyance to fishermen. You know, so is there a budget to remove that type of growth? Plus, as you well know, the amount of silt and peat that is in the River Shannon. I mean, capacity has been really badly affected over the years. And I want to know, is there a budget to cover that? Fourthly, in relation to flood defences, it appears to me that we're looking at masses of concrete as flood defences. And surely we should be eco-friendly and environmentally friendly and follow other parts of the world where they don't use these concrete defences, which will look appalling around towns like Roscommon or Carrick-on-Shannon. So, like, is it going to be where we are putting up flood defences that it's all going to be mass concrete? And finally, I know you have spoken about the issue of insurance. And again, some great work carried out in Ballinasloe and Galway. But unfortunately, again, you know, residents, businesses, families cannot get their property insured. Now again, I appreciate it's not all in your arena, that area, but it is causing a lot of frustration and distress. And finally, I just say, in relation to coastal erosion and coastal damage, is there a budget to deal with that? Because I visited, I'm our party spokesperson on OPW and flood relief, and I did visit Inishowen with that horrendous storm which occurred, and to see the damage that was done there was absolutely shocking. And I know monies are being spent there to rectify a lot of the damage done. So is there part of that budget to deal with coastal damage, coastal erosion? Thank you, Deputy.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy, or Eugene. So I'll deal with a couple of those points myself, and then ask John to come in on the relocation scheme and the insurance question, maybe in the coastal budget, and Mark would be our expert here, so you might be able to comment on the Turlock study and perhaps the concrete defences. But first of all, the budget itself, the €1 billion, it is ring-fenced within the OPW budget for flood relief works. So insofar as the government is in a position to meet the capital programme, which obviously, I mean, there could be a national crisis, but hopefully not, that money is allocated to flood defences, and the emergency response is primarily through local authorities. So that money would be for defence measures, not for emergency response to individual schemes. So that's good news on that. With regard to the River Shannon, there is a Shannon group bring together all the agencies with an interest and with an involvement there in the River Shannon, and there are a number of targeted measures being undertaken at the moment to address specific points along the Shannon, quite a number around Malik, to improve the river flow and capacity, to remove trees and so on. There's no maintenance programme per se, and to do so would involve quite an extensive, perhaps a change of legislation and quite a lot of environmental work. So what is happening though is there's two very important studies being undertaken. One is with respect to the Callows region that you'll know very well below Athlone, as regards the possibility, the environmental and economic assessment of the removal of a number of the pinch points there in the Callows region, and could that make sense, and would that be justified? And a second study is being undertaken in the lower Shannon, the old channel of the Shannon, parallel to Ardnacrusha, to assess the hydromorphological, and please don't ask me to spell that word, the hydromorphological impact over the 100 years or so that Ardnacrusha has been in place on the old channel. How has it changed? How will it change in the future? And are there measures maybe that could be initiated to help preserve the capacity of that channel? So there is a lot being done there. John, I might ask you then to come in on the relocation scheme, the stats around that, and insurance and coastal.
Okay. We'll come back to you, Deputy, in terms of the detailed statistics and the number of applicants we've processed and the numbers going through the system vis-à-vis the home relocation scheme. So we'll get that back to you.
The clerk, and then we'll circulate.
Indeed, we will, yeah. Insurance.
I don't want to be interrupting. Have you any idea if anybody has been relocated offhand?
At the moment, nobody's actually been relocated. There are a number going through the actual formal processes as prescribed by the system. Okay. Insurance I spoke about earlier. We have the Memorandum of Understanding with the Insurance Federation. We pass information on, and based on what we provide them, they increase the insurance cover in the areas that we've actually protected. And the more schemes we deliver, aka the greater the level of insurance provided. Coastal erosion is another issue you raised, Deputy. OPW has, as part of CFRAM, identified 90 coastal communities that potentially will be impacted by coastal flooding. In all other respects, the respective local authorities have primary responsibility for dealing with issues of coastal erosion. OPW, for its part, will assess applications from funding from respective local authorities. If they identify a need and set out a proposed scheme, it comes to us, we assess it, and we provide the funding to them. A good exemplar would be Portrane, which was impacted significantly by coastal erosion. The local authority, Fingal County Council, engaged consultants, produced a scheme for, in the first instance, interim protection to protect a number of houses at risk. That was submitted to us, and we provided £500,000 in funding to Fingal County Council to start immediate work on the implementation of local coastal defences. I'll pass you over now to my colleague Mark, who will actually talk about the other two issues, specifically the turlocks
and the nature of the flood defences.
Yes, in terms of the Turlock study, this is being undertaken by the GSI with Trinity College Dublin, but in partnership with ourselves. The study is progressing well. Models have been built for quite a large number of turlocks at this point. I don't have the exact number to hand. I think it's in the order of 40. And there is flood mapping associated with each of the turlocks due to be produced, I think, this year. And as I understand that the study will be completed next year. In relation to the schemes and the use of mass concrete, while we are looking to protect communities, we would only be doing that in a way that's acceptable to the community. We do undertake quite intensive consultation, and the public consultation days, as a former member here referred to. And we have been looking to build the schemes into the existing urban environment. As I mentioned to Senator O'Sullivan, we are looking also now to be putting a greater emphasis on sort of public realm enhancements and multiple benefits that can be attached to a significant investment like that. Thank you.
For example, in Crossmaglen, it was mentioned earlier, we're proposing to bypass 12 kilometres of river, the River Deal, I think, with a channel, so that when there is a flooding event, rather than concrete walls, which wouldn't work in that situation, there's a bypass there. And we mentioned Clonakilty as well, where we're looking to, it's an artificial sort of a flood area, which relates a little bit to your question as well, Senator. But there's no doubt about it, because we're dealing with crisis situations, very serious flood events, it's hard to completely avoid the necessity for concrete walls in some sense.
I just want to compliment you on your involvement in the minor work scheme, because that is doing a lot of work and it's avoiding a lot of places and people being flooded, so that's a really good scheme.
Deputy Sherlock.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you for your forbearance. I'm very grateful to you. Just first of all, I'm grateful for to have this opportunity to interact with the commissioners in the OPW. I'll just go straight into it. In terms of management of the state property portfolio and the buildings element, the built environment, if you will, I'm looking to the Citizens Assembly report here, and there is a very specific recommendation on the voted recommendations where 100% of the members, and I quote, recommended that the state should take a leadership role in addressing climate change through mitigation measures, including, for example, retrofitting public buildings. Okay, so it's very clear, and you would have read that before coming in here today. So I'm looking then to your presentation, and I'm asking myself, why is it that the vast majority of buildings, 79%, have a rating of C, that's 42%, or D, and that's 37%? Is, you know, and I do appreciate the point that you're making, that the majority of poor performing buildings, you know, have exceptional electric loads, data centres and so on. Can we be more ambitious in relation to that target? Is there language that can be used to say, look, we're now, you know, we're looking at the 12-year window now, and can the OPW become more radical in terms of getting those C's and D's up to B's and A's, if you will? That's the first point. And you know, I think for us the IPCC report, and you'll have heard us repeating the IPCC report numerous times throughout the day, that the trajectory now is completely different, and that has to give rise to more radical policies by government and, you know, by extension, you know, the departments of state. So I just want to get a sense of urgency from you, or a sense that, you know, that this new target, or these new temperature, or these new limit warnings, for instance, are just, you know, they're very scary, to be quite frank about it. And you know, I'd love to see something in terms of us being able to write a report that says, you know, we're satisfied that the OPW, who manages the state property portfolio, is moving more radically towards, you know, moving towards A's and B's in terms of BER ratings.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Before I pass some of those points on to my colleagues for comment on the building side, so we have fairly extreme measures in place in terms of new buildings, the NZEB, and in terms of deep retrofit. I mean, you get 60 to 70% savings when we can do that. The problem is, so that's very reassuring, so it means that the situation is not going to get worse, it's going to get better. The problem is, we have in the region of 500 or 600 buildings being used as office space at the moment. So to retrofit, deep retrofit all of those would be a phenomenal amount of money. And the government would have to decide whether to prioritise whatever investment is available for those activities, those buildings, or to spend it in other areas, in transport, in agriculture, in other areas where maybe the impact on climate change might be more effective. I mean, we will do our part for sure, and we will, as we said earlier, progressively address the older buildings. The reason why they're C and D predominantly is because a lot of the government buildings are by very nature buildings that were built at the foundation of the state 100 years ago. They're historical buildings, so they were not built obviously to a high energy retention standard, and it's difficult to get in and do retrofit works. But maybe Kieran and Jim, you can probably comment more details on that.
I think on the heritage side, I mean, to certain buildings you cannot go change them because of their heritage benefit. But where that choice would come in, for instance, where you might be doing some place like Castletown, you'd also look at what other things you can improve, your energy usage, your systems to control that, better environmental issues. And for instance, on a project that we've mentioned about the forensic science building, your 25 air changes an hour in that building, huge air loss, but we're going to regain most of that heat back. But as a subset of that, when we're doing the foundation works for that building, we're using them as part of the defence security element to defend the building for intruder, but it's part of the landscape, and that has saved us not bringing any soil off-site to put into landfill. So those sort of wider issues we would take on board as part of that broad spectrum of approach. But we'd have a core and comprehensive approach. So the core would be the minimum elements, so it would be the lighting, the energy, that aspect, and then if you can go to the comprehensive would be the further deep retrofit.
Okay, thank you. Just then on the CFRAMs, I'm from the great county of Cork. Eamon Ryan's people were baptised in the River Lee. I was baptised in the black water, metaphorically speaking, and we do speak about flood defences, and we have very clear evidence base of structural works on the Munster Blackwater at Fermoy and at Mallow, and they are phenomenally successful. And I think anybody who has any doubts about whether or not demountable walls work, there is incontrovertible proof that they do work. But notwithstanding that, and notwithstanding the issues in relation to migratory fish and so on, which is what Deputy Ryan refers to, for which is a slightly different issue, not quite pertinent to this one. That relates to a fish pass at a particular point, which is in disrepair, which is not necessarily within your remit, but I think it's important to put that on the record. But the question is, there are 118 flood relief schemes. And flood relief programmes, by their nature, Chairman, were always designed with the 100-year flood in mind. Because I was formerly a mayor of my town, and when we were going through the process, we were saying we were being told you're designing for the 100-year flood. I fail to understand the intervention that Mr. Adamson made in relation to the planning, and maybe I missed something in terms of your dialogue there. Have we now surpassed the 100-year flood mark, if you will, or benchmark in terms of planning for flooding events? That's the first part of that question, and the second part relates to that then. Should we now be using agricultural land to slow down flooding? And should we be paying farmers, quite literally, who are on floodplains, some sort of compensation to say, no building on your land, no planting, no grazing, and allow for natural drainage schemes to take place. So you have then in that a structural solution to flooding, Chair, and you also have then maybe a kind of a more natural solution. And I just want to get a sense from the OPW of one, in the point in relation to the 100-year floods, and two, then in relation to not just having a pure engineering solution, but to bring other solutions into the mix in relation to land use. So that's that point.
Mr. Butler.
All right. Before I pass it over to Mark Adamson, just in terms of the 100 years, fluvial flooding, river flooding is targeted to the 100-year event. In other words, a 1% probability of a flood. Coastal flooding is a 200-year event, so a 0.5% probability. But I think, I'm sure Mark will clarify it, as climate change happens and the frequency of storm events increases, presumably what was 1 in 100 years 5 years ago might be 1 in 50 years in 10 years' time. Would you agree?
It'll vary around the country. I suppose the primary focus of what we're looking at through the CFRAM is to protect against an existing risk. There's a significant existing risk there. We've seen in recent flood events that large numbers of properties have flooded. So the primary focus is now to tackle that immediate problem. However, clearly we're aware that climate change can make flooding worse, and so we need to take that into account. Now, how exactly that is done will vary on a scheme-by-scheme basis. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to climate change adaptability for flood relief schemes. It depends very much on the local context of each individual town. So if I take Crossmolina as an example, there's a bridge in Crossmolina town. If the river level rises too high, there actually becomes a buoyancy issue, and the historic bridge could pop up. So we have a diversion channel which takes the flood flows around Clonakilty. And then in terms of thinking, well, how can we adapt for potential future change? We can't send greater flows down through the town and build walls because we have the problem with the bridge. So the solution for adaptation in Crossmolina is to enhance the capacity of the diversion channel to take the mid-range future scenario flow. So in that instance, what we've taken is what we call the assumptive approach. Okay. So we're assuming a certain design allowance for climate change. In other areas, we may take an adaptive approach, so particularly if you say flood defences, where we might build the foundations of a flood defence wall to a size where they could be increased in height in the future if necessary. And in other instances, there may be alternative approaches, which may include in providing storage upstream at a future date, which again can help reduce the flood flows down through the town. And in other instances, such as Cork, there will actually be a mix of all three. So there's a range of ways that we can try and make sure that our schemes are adaptable to climate change, but we have to look at each of them on a case-by-case basis. Notwithstanding that, we are maintaining the 100-year standard protection for fluvial schemes in the current scenario, but we have to do that conscious that effectively we will need to perhaps in some instances raise the standards so that we're catering for what might become a 100-year in 50 years' time, for example. Okay. In relation to using floodplains for storage, I'd refer in the first instance to a previous response where there are very, very few channels throughout Ireland which are embanked. And so effectively the rivers are already using the storage that's available to them. Having said that, there are certainly areas where we can effectively enhance the use of that storage. So Clonakilty, for example, the scheme there is looking at, in flood conditions, increasing the depth of storage in the floodplains upstream of the town. In the Lower Lee Cork City scheme, we're looking at utilising the rural land between Cork City and Inishgara as effectively as washland, and so making use of that additional storage during flood events. Thank you.
And last question then, just going back to Cork again. Did I hear you correctly when you said that the cost of a Thames barrier type structure would be €1 billion? And if that is the figure I heard, had you done some scenario planning or engineered a solution to that effect? Because you didn't just pluck €1 billion, if I heard you correctly, out of the air. You must have had some internal discussions on that. And following on from that then, because of some of the angst that exists within Cork City, which I don't share personally at this juncture. I differ from my colleague Deputy Ryan on this one, but I have an open mind on this. You're moving towards a demountable type scenario, as I understand it. And I just wanted a clarification on that point as well.
So, first of all, in terms of the tidal barrage, you have to take the total cost of the system into account. So there'll be a physical cost for just the barrier itself, but then there's embankments, there's a design, there's floodplains, there's everything associated with that. And the budget for that, I'll ask John to come in. And we did a study, and we have a figure on that.
Okay. And where were you going to put it, Morris? Like, were you going to put it outside the Spike, or were you going to put it by Blackrock Castle, or where, if it was going to go somewhere? Sorry, Chair.
You're gone off now into a local issue there.
Oh no, but it has a major impact in relation to the whole of the Lee Valley and.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but really we're sticking
it's actually
to
it's quite pertinent to.
Fine, but you know, this is kind of straying into all sorts of parochial things now.
Apologise.
Go ahead, Mr. Buckley.
Okay, I think there was 3 different scenarios looked at, 3 different locations, and the deep channel, the shallow channel at the mouth of Loch Mahon there. But again, I'll come back to that, or I'll ask John to come back on that. In terms of the flood defences in Cork City, that project, and we know how sensitive it is, and we respect the sensitivities involved from a number of different aspects. It's gone through several rounds of public consultation, and we have tried to adapt the design each time when we get feedback. One of the important points was there were sections of flood defence wall, only short sections of maybe 50 or 100 metres where the height was very significant, so young children going by wouldn't be able to see over the wall, and we have redesigned that with demountable defences or with transparent defences, similar to what we've done in Waterford City, for example, to improve that. So a number of improvements have been made around Morrison's Islands and other sections of that I think will actually really enhance the area around it for lots of different reasons. John, do you want to come back in on the tidal barrage itself, barrier?
I think we have looked at this in very considerable detail, and on 2 separate occasions we commissioned a far more detailed study the second time around. And I think one of the significant issues is where you locate it, as you alluded to yourself. I think where one of the local lobby groups were suggesting you would put it, you would run into very significant environmental issues in where they suggested putting it. And in terms of building this, there's environmental considerations, there's navigation in terms of the Port of Cork and its successful operations. And where it's feasible to put as we've said, and we've always said, yes, you can put one in. It's when you put it in terms of the previous conversation. But we did a very detailed analysis. Our cost estimate of putting it in the location we would think it would need to go, is in a region of 1 billion. And we can make that available to the committee if required. It's in the public domain.
Where exactly?
Oh, yeah, I think it's the exact location. I think it's just above Monkstown. It's on that channel.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. So I'd like to thank Mr Buckley and his colleagues for your contributions here this evening. It's very helpful to us. And as there's no other business, the meeting of the Joint Committee is adjourned until Wednesday, the 7th of November at 2.
One last question, if I can, just because I hadn't thought about it afterwards. And it's important because if the state itself couldn't meet the target for energy efficiency, which is the most easy to achieve in a sense that the building fabric changes are very precise, and you can. When did we realise we weren't going to go meet the target, and why didn't we adjust our investment or our budget portfolio? The fact that the state itself failed to meet its own target in its own buildings is quite symbolic of the wider failing across the state in meeting our targets. When did we find out we realised that we were off track in terms of meeting our efficiency target?
I think if you look at the 2017 report produced by the Department, the strategy document where the assessment is made based on the SEI analysis of 21% in the public building space versus a target of 33%, that details group of buildings by group of buildings and gives a kind of a traffic light code as to which areas of the public sector will meet the target. So, for example, we would be very confident that in our own OPW buildings that we occupy, we'll meet the target. In large sections of the agencies and in large sections of the accommodation areas that we provide, the target will be met. But for some of the areas, some of the local authority space, for some of the Garda Síochána stations, which are small old buildings and buildings designed with other priorities in mind, it will not be possible to reach the 33% by 2020. But for example, the Garda stations are over 20%. They're over the national target. It would take a phenomenal investment to get there. And that was identified in the report, and I mentioned it in my opening statement. And I think, as we discussed a moment ago, for the government, it is a question of prioritising where available funding is put. So certainly, if funding can be supplied to retrofit public buildings on large scales, we can organise to do that. But the question has to be asked is whether that funding is best applied to buildings or to transport or to agriculture or to the different areas where to get the maximum impact on climate change, which I'm sure is the work of this committee for the last number of weeks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As there's no other business, the meeting is adjourned until Wednesday, the 7th of November at 2 p.m.